Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The shrill ring of Marcus's phone cut through the October dawn like a knife. 6 a.m, unknown number. He rubbed his eyes and answered with a gravelly voice. Hello. Good morning. This is regarding the security position for tonight's shift. We've reviewed your application, very impressive. 2 tour in Afghanistan, special operations background, 5 years of combat experience. You're exactly what we need. If you're still interested, meet our representative at Glacier Point helicopter pad in 3 hours. Marcus sat up straighter. The job posting had been vague, just good money for one night's work. No company name, no details. The salary mentioned in the ad, that's really for just one night. No mistake. $100,000 for tonight's shift. Half up front when you report for duty, half when your replacement arrives at 8 tomorrow morning. Marcus nearly dropped the phone. That kind of money for 12 hours. Something wasn't right, but his bank account was running on fumes. I'll be there in 3 hours. Helicopter ride through the Alaskan wilderness took 2 hours, winding between snow-capped peaks and endless forests. The pilot, a weathered man in military surplus gear, didn't speak much beyond basic directions. As they descended toward a clearing, Marcus could see their destination, a single-story concrete building that looked like it had been abandoned for decades, sitting alone in a valley surrounded by towering pines. What exactly am I guarding? Marcus shouted over the rotor noise. Classified research facility. Pentagon Black Ops. Location and operations are need to know only. You'll get briefed on the ground. The facility's security chief, a stern man in his 50s, met Marcus at the landing zone. The tour was brief but unsettling. Above ground, the building looked like a Cold War relic. Crumbling concrete walls, broken windows, rust stains bleeding down the sides. The elevator inside descended 60 feet underground to a state-of-the-art research complex that hummed with sophisticated equipment. In the security office, Marcus found 4 other men. All had the same look, military bearing, 1,000-yard stares, the kind of scars that came from seeing too much action. Communications are restricted, the security chief announced to the group. No internet, no cell service, just internal systems. Your shift ends at 8 a.m. when the day team arrives. Gentlemen, have a quiet night. The security room was a fortress of technology, dozens of monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the complex, and a massive wall-mounted display that had to be at least 100 inches across. An oversized clock dominated one wall, its hands pointing to 6:30 p.m. Jake, a compact man with medic patches still visible on his jacket, broke the silence first. Anyone know what this place actually is? Me, the youngest of the group, looked up from shuffling a deck of cards. I did some digging. Turns out they hire 5 contractors every year for exactly one shift, always on Halloween night. The 213th day counting from March 21st. Probably rotating security to find permanent hires, Rodriguez said, his accent thick with years of special forces training. Smart way to screen candidates. Wilson, who'd been examining the electronic equipment, looked skeptical. For this kind of money, something's not adding up. Who cares? Tommy grinned, dealing cards. Easy money for babysitting an empty building. I checked the fridge, no beer, but plenty of food and energy drinks. The men settled into poker, sharing war stories and complaints about civilian life. The hours passed peacefully until midnight struck. A grinding, metallic screech echoed from deep within the facility. All conversation stopped. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered. They studied the monitors intently. Empty corridors, vacant rooms, nothing moving. The sound had been like metal being torn apart, but every camera showed the same thing, nothing. Wilson pointed at monitor 4. "Look at the north lab." In the corner of the room stood a figure, humanoid but wrong somehow. It appeared to be a mannequin, completely featureless where its face should be, yet it seemed to be staring directly into the camera. "Probably been there the whole time and we just noticed," Rodriguez said, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus grabbed a radio. "I'll check it out." "I'm hitting the head," Tommy said, also taking a radio. "All that coffee is catching up with me." The facility felt different now, heavier, like the air itself was watching. Marcus made his way to the north lab, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sick red glow. The north lab was exactly as it appeared on camera, sterile, empty, and dominated by the mannequin in the corner. Marcus approached it slowly. The thing was unsettling, not just faceless, but somehow actively malevolent in its blankness. "Guys, it's just a training dummy or something," he radioed back. Creepy as hell, but harmless. But as he spoke, he could have sworn the thing's blank face had changed. For just a moment, he'd seen eyes cold, calculating, and filled with a terrible hunger. "Wait," came Jake's voice over the radio. "What did you say about its face?" "It doesn't have one, just blank." "That's not what I'm seeing on the monitor. From here, it looks like it's smiling." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. He stared at the mannequin, and for a brief second he saw it too, a face filled with malicious joy, watching him with predatory interest. A light fixture crashed from the ceiling, striking Marcus in the head and plunging half the room into darkness. Pain exploded across his scalp as he staggered backward. "Marcus, you okay?" Wilson's voice crackled through the radio. "Yeah, just." Light fell. "I'm bleeding, but I'm fine. Coming back." When he returned to the security office, Jake immediately began treating his wound. As Jake worked, Marcus glanced at monitor 4 and froze. The mannequin was now standing in the center of the room, facing the camera directly. Its face was a mask of pure malevolence, eyes that burned with inhuman intelligence and a smile that promised terrible things. "Is this some kind of joke?" Marcus demanded. "Who moved that thing? What are you talking about?" Rodriguez asked. "The mannequin. It was in the corner when I left." The men looked at each other uneasily. "Speaking of which, where's Tommy?" Wilson asked. "He should have been back by now." Marcus tried the radio. "Tommy, you copy? Don't tell me you fell asleep in there." Static. Then, clear as day, the sound of a child laughing, high, innocent, and completely wrong in this place. "Very funny," Rodriguez growled. "Cut the games and get back here." But the laughter continued, joined by more voices, children playing, giggling, whispering secrets in the dark. Marcus and Wilson exchanged looks. "Let's go find him." The bathroom door hung open, creaking softly in a non-existent breeze. Inside, the lights wouldn't work. Using their radio lights, they searched each stall. In the third stall, Marcus found something that made his combat-hardened stomach lurch. On the floor lay a human eye, fresh, still wet, torn from its socket with surgical precision. "Jesus Christ," Wilson breathed. "Is that real?" Jake pushed past them, his medic training taking over. He knelt and examined it carefully. "It's human, recently removed within the last hour. The tissue damage suggests it was extracted while the subject was alive." "That's impossible," Rodriguez said from the doorway. "We've all been together. Where's Tommy?" "I've been with you guys the whole time," Wilson protested. "And you can see there's only 4 of us here." The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in that hellish red glow. But something was wrong with the light. It seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and in the rhythm they could hear whispers. "The electrical room," Marcus decided. "Jake, you're with me. You two get back to security and watch the monitors." The electrical room was at the end of a long corridor lined with research labs. As they approached, they could hear something moving inside, a slow, deliberate scratching like fingernails on metal. Marcus opened the door and stepped inside. Immediately, it slammed shut behind him, and he found himself somewhere impossible. The room had become vast, a cavern stretching into darkness. In the center stood a single streetlight casting a circle of sickly yellow illumination. Beneath it sat a child's swing set, and on the swing sat a figure. It was Tommy, or something wearing Tommy's face. The thing looked up at Marcus with eyes that held no humanity, only a bottomless hunger. When it smiled, Marcus could see that its teeth were too sharp, too many. "Want to play?" It asked in Tommy's voice, but underneath was something else, the sound of grinding metal and breaking glass. Marcus closed his eyes and began counting, just like his drill sergeant had taught him during interrogation resistance training. 1. He forced himself to remember his daughter's birth. The moment she'd first opened her eyes and looked at him with perfect trust. 2. His wedding day. The way his wife had looked walking down the aisle, radiant in white lace, promising him forever. 3. Christmas morning when his daughter was 5. The way she'd screamed with joy at seeing her presents, the pure happiness that filled their home. But the memories began to twist. His daughter's face became blank, featureless. His wife's wedding dress turned to grave clothes. Christmas morning became a funeral. 4. The thing that wore Tommy's face was standing now, walking toward him with movements that were just wrong enough to trigger every primal fear. 5. Something cold touched his shoulder. Breath like winter wind whispered in his ear. "Found you," Marcus screamed. The door burst open and Jake stood there, silhouetted against the red emergency lighting. "Marcus, what happened? You were yelling." Marcus looked around. He was in a small, cramped electrical room. No cavern, no street light, no swing set, just circuit breakers and the smell of ozone. What did you see?" He went in, slammed the door, and started shouting. Had to kick it open. Jake helped him to his feet and flipped the main breaker. Normal lighting returned to the facility. Back in the security room, they found only Rodriguez. He was pale, shaking. "Where's Wilson?" Jake demanded. "Gone. We split up to search faster. I went left, he went right. When I got back, he wasn't here. But look at monitor 7. The screen showed a corridor they'd walked down hundreds of times that night. Now it was different. The walls were covered in something dark and wet, and scattered across the floor were pieces of what might once have been human. They ran to that corridor, but found nothing. Clean walls, empty floor, just Wilson's radio lying abandoned. The cameras are showing things that aren't there, Marcus realized. Or things that were there, Rodriguez laughed, but there was hysteria in it. Or maybe we're the ones who aren't really here. Marcus sat down at the security chief's computer and began hacking into the system files. What he found made his blood run cold. "Listen to this," he said. "This facility was built in 1953 for experimental research into quantum consciousness manipulation. The goal was to weaponize traumatic memories, turn them into tools for interrogation and control. Jake was staring at the monitors. Every screen now showed mannequins, dozens of them, all wearing security uniforms identical to theirs, all staring directly into the cameras with faces that shifted between blank and malevolently human. The first test was conducted on Halloween night, 1954. Marcus continued reading. 5 subjects, all military veterans with combat trauma. At exactly 2:13 a.m., all subjects vanished without a trace. No bodies, no evidence, just empty rooms. Rodriguez had found food in the refrigerator and was eating mechanically, as if the act of consuming something real could anchor him to reality. Every year since then, the same thing. 5 contractors, Halloween night, 2:13 a.m. They all disappear. The facility was designed to interact with traumatic memories, Marcus read on, to make them manifest physically. The theory was that soldiers who had seen enough horror would be immune to psychological warfare. Instead, they discovered that trauma creates bridges, doorways to places that should remain closed. The clock on the wall showed 2:12 a.m. The mannequins were moving now, walking through corridors that led inexorably toward the security room. Their faces had settled into expressions of hungry anticipation, and Marcus recognized some of them other contractors from other years, their faces twisted into masks of eternal terror. Jake was still eating, seemingly oblivious to the approaching horror. "You know what I think," he said conversationally. "I think we've been dead since we got here. I think this whole night has been the moment of our death, stretched out like taffy." 2:13 a.m. The lights went out for the final time. In the darkness, Marcus could hear them coming, footsteps that weren't quite right, breathing that sounded like wind through broken teeth, and underneath it all, the laughter of children who had never existed. Marcus closed his eyes one last time. 1. He was 5 years old, learning to swim in a lake while his father watched from the shore, proud and protective. But the water was too dark now, too deep, and something was swimming up from the depths with too many teeth and eyes like dying stars. The security room door began to splinter. In the morning, the day shift would find 5 empty uniforms, 5 abandoned radios, and security footage that showed nothing but empty rooms. The mannequins would be back in their storage closet, faces blank and innocent. Somewhere in the classified files, a notation would be made. Year 71 of Project Mindbridge. 5 additional subjects successfully integrated, preparing for year 72. The experiments would continue, because that's what experiments do. They iterate, they evolve, and they feed on the very thing that makes us human, our capacity to remember and our inability to forget. After all, what is horror but memory given form? And what is memory but the ghost of experience, forever haunting the rooms of our minds? The 213th hour had claimed 5 more souls, and in the depths of the facility, something ancient and hungry settled back to sleep, dreaming dreams of trauma and terror, waiting for next Halloween night to feed again. After getting laid off, Jake Parker spent 2 months without work. Since he had never managed to save any serious money before, by the end of summer, he was worried about eating his last can of beans. Jake started looking for a new job right away. However, his search brought no results because in his area, work was scarce, and those who had jobs held on to them with both hands and teeth. Even if you were ready to go to hell for a small paycheck, you still wouldn't find an employer, and no matter how talented you were, there was nothing you could do about it. Toward the end of his search, he started scouring the internet far and wide, looking at distant opportunities. He realized that he would get work, but along with it, in a foreign area, he would have to face a bunch of difficulties and problems of a different order. One day, while giving a ride to a hitchhiker in his old pickup truck, Jake was surprised to learn from him that security guards were apparently needed at a warehouse facility near an ancient, long-abandoned lumber mill. The owners had been operating warehouses there since the days when the local Native American tribes still roamed these lands freely. In recent years, these warehouses had been used exclusively by Oregon and Washington lumber processing companies. But now they had caught the attention of large companies from Seattle and Portland as a transshipment base. The warehouse complex had not lost its significance. Now trains passed through it one after another, unloading and taking something away, freeing up vital space for trucks with huge trailers. That same day, Jake drove to the warehouses, planning only to scout around. But it turned out that the prehistoric mechanisms in the old facility were spinning incredibly fast and in new ways. They handed him a form, almost forced him to write a resume, and suggested he quickly bring copies of some personal documents and photographs. Returning to his truck, Jake thought, why not? Since work is coming right into my hands, I'll go get photographed. Maybe I'll manage to bring the missing documents by the end of the day. He had driven about 10,000 meters from the facility gates when he noticed a dark SUV with heavily tinted windows racing after him at full speed. Now they're going to beat me up for something, the guy decided, stopping on the shoulder and internally preparing to give his ill-wishers a hard fight with large bills. But no fight occurred. Racing after Jake was the head of security. He had been checking the video surveillance system on the territory and had stopped by the personnel department by chance, where he learned about the new candidate. I would put you on duty tonight, said the security chief, but you can't work without a background check. I don't have enough people. Logically and by common sense, with the expansion of the warehouses, there should be at least 2 guards, but there's nowhere to recruit them. And from the locals, he waved his hand uncertainly toward the distance. Some have it written on their faces that they're alcoholics and don't care about guarding the facility. Others, you can see in their eyes that on the first night, they'll go to ransack the warehouses with a crowbar under their arm. Jake Parker's background check was completed in record time, and now a week of honest and well-paid work was behind the guy. Knock and it will be open to you spun in Jake's head, long and thoroughly forgotten words. He thought about the fact that, by and large, he didn't have to knock much. He raised his hand to knock, but the door opened by itself in front of him. Jake heard Ray's voice from the radio. Can you hear me? Yes, I'm here, Ray, Jake responded, letting his head hang limply as he anticipated tedious charades from the second guard. Jake's partner was more of a template guard than a person, a pattern for cutting and sewing by example. Everything about him was from this profession. Even in his everyday clothes, Ray looked exactly like a security guard. You'd see him on the street and wouldn't be mistaken. Even if you happened to encounter him on a nudist beach where Ray wouldn't have a shirt, standing in one place, even then you'd immediately guess that you were looking at a security guard by the shape of his rear end and the look of a dormitory watchman. Jake, I need help with this puzzle. Who is this actor? Following the template, Guard Ray was a big fan of all sorts of crosswords. This time he had gotten his hands on a word puzzle where instead of questions, pictures were printed. Jake had been watching Ray work on this particular puzzle for a while. It turned out that contemporary politicians and composers from the century before last were for Ray most often also actors. God knows, maybe he's not an actor, the second guard sighed. Okay, forget him. You'd better help me with this girl. Jake would have been happy to help, and not just so Ray would leave him alone. He would have handled both the actor and the girl, but the trouble was that the guards were located in different sectors of the territory in identical booths. like small cabins. Ray was near the main entrance, Jake Parker in the opposite corner, where the lumber warehouses were located. Only the fluctuating wave of radio communication in the invisible ether connected them. Of all the clues, Jake could only help figure out the one by hat and scarf. Ray was delighted and thanked him. But a few seconds later, the radio hissed again. "Jake, it's not Bogart. The letters don't fit. I've got Eastwood written here next to it, and as usual, it messed everything up." "Let's go back to the actor," Ray reported. Jake, with his limited knowledge, decided not to clarify anything, didn't argue. He took a deep breath, inflating his chest, calming down. If the letters don't fit, then they don't fit. What's there to do about it? "So who is this then?" Ray persisted. "Ray, I can't see it, and from just the clues, I can't picture it well," Jake said. For some time, the radio was silent, then came to life and reproaches poured from it. "That's what's wrong with today's youth," Ray wheezed. "You don't finish anything as you should. You grab onto something new, and even then you don't finish it. Our generation isn't like that. We wouldn't turn back halfway." While his partner, having turned into a mentor, was reading his lecture, Jake frowned with displeasure. He tried not to lose his temper and not respond to Ray that young people, of course, are burdened with their own problems, rushing around and fussing. But far worse are such old-timers who consciously reject the new, aren't interested, don't know, but always have an opinion on any issue, and are ready to demonstrate awareness that doesn't exist at all. The radio crackled again. Ray, illuminated by a bright idea, cheerfully shouted, "I've got it. Hey, let's try this." "What?" Jake became alert. Ray had never shown initiative before, limiting himself to brain extraction. So Jake's concern was quite reasonable. "Do you have the image from the main gate displayed on your monitor?" Ray asked. "Yes." "Switch to it so it shows full screen. I'll walk over to it and show you both this mustachioed idiot and the girl." "All right," Jake said syllable by syllable, making it clear to the second guard that his idea didn't particularly impress him, and he would have returned to reading his book with much greater joy. Ray had probably already left his booth when Jake remembered something important and grabbed his radio, calling his partner. "Ray, wait, I'm here." "What is it, Jake?" the hoarse speaker responded. "Be careful near Warehouse 3. Don't forget they dug everything up there." "Yes, I remember," Ray said with a hint of offense. "By the way, do you know what kind of hole they dug there?" "What for?" "They didn't dig it, they uncovered it," Ray corrected in a mentoring tone. "There used to be a lab building there. Over time, they demolished the sky and buried the foundation with the basement. Then they forgot about it." "I see," said Jake, "but be careful anyway." One of the co-owners of the warehouse facility had noticed the convenient location of Warehouse 3 and decided to set up a platform for trailers nearby so that arriving trucks would only need to hook up pre-prepared loads. As soon as they started clearing the adjacent territory, a bulldozer fell through. They got it out quickly, but before the workers opened a gaping chasm of pitch darkness. Even when the sun stood exactly in the center of the sky, a deathly cold emanated from the pit. At the same time, it didn't spread the slightest smell, although it should have, like any hole in the marshy northern soil. Nothing but cold emanated from what looked like an icy, almost sterile cave. One of the construction workers joked that the hole was nothing other than an exit to space, the emptiest, darkest, and gloomiest section of it, no less than this portal to nowhere. The workers were shocked by the trunks of giant trees with which, in ancient times, someone had covered the chasm. They decided not to make noise about the discovery. While the warehouse owners wondered what to do with the unwanted find, they convinced themselves that they had stumbled upon the remains of a base abandoned who knows when. and that the cold came because the basement of the collapsed building had never housed an ice house for perishable products. This explanation was sufficient for all the security guards, without exception. "Jake, you idiot," unexpectedly came from the speaker. Radio echoed, causing the words to break apart into syllables in the ether and reach Jake with distortion. The unusual sounds made the guy feel sick, and his partner's speech seemed something unimaginably distant, as if it had overcome incredible distances, pierced space and the thickness of time. Jake Parker squeezed the button on his radio as if he were pressing a machine gun trigger. However, he couldn't answer Ray immediately. His saliva had become heavy and seemed to stick his tongue to his palate. "Not me," Jake finally managed to squeeze out of himself, and immediately shouted so that the second guard would hear him even without the radio. "Are you afraid, Jake? And here I thought you were a joker," Ray responded with irony, and from his voice it was clear that he had stopped. "Stop. I can see the tree," Jake said. "Oh my God." And the next moment Ray screamed horribly, panicked, like no one screams from pain, like no actor would scream in the best horror movie. Inside Jake, everything snapped, and a huge piece of ice seemed to be thrown into his stomach. He pressed himself against the monitor screens, but the cameras only showed his sectors of observation and the picture from the main gate. "Ray, Ray," Jake called into the radio. The answer was silence. From acute tense attention, from waiting and worrying, Jake's ears began to ring. When something seemed to move outside the window, Jake thought that a loader or construction worker might have remained on the facility grounds. It was unclear why, but possibly. And if someone was prowling around the warehouses, he might not have the kindest plans for the local security. "They'll beat and tie me up, that's one thing. They might even shoot me, because rarely does anyone love guard dogs," Michael thought. From outside the window came an otherworldly howl. "Come to us, Jake." Only now did the guard remember the weapon issued to him. His hand was already reaching for the holster on his belt, and Jake hoped that the seconds allotted to him by fate would be enough to extract the weapon, quickly prepare it for shooting, and open fire. "I can smell that you've wet yourself in there," Ray shouted from behind the door and burst into such loud laughter that the glass in the window rattled. "Congratulations, buddy. Now you're a real guard. You could say you've passed initiation." Ray continued to laugh heartily, standing in the doorway. "Initiation," Jake Parker corrected without much enthusiasm. "I've been racking my brains all week thinking what kind of joke to play. Oh, in the old days, Valerie and I, my old buddy, used to pull such stunts. I'll tell you about it sometime. Like those bolts on the fence, you can't see them. And when there's a little breeze, it seems like someone invisible is prowling around. Which of the guys it would still be okay. But when Mrs. Grundy got scared, she had a fit and ran away." Jake listened, but didn't absorb it. He couldn't calm a strong fit of anger that literally burned through him. Only he wasn't grinding his teeth and wasn't waving his fists in front of his partner's nose. If Ray had been younger, Jake wouldn't have endured it and would have expressed everything he thought about the stupid, really thoughtless childishness of Ray, and would have tried to choose such expressions that would make ears curl into tubes. And some listeners, instead of sharp phrases, would prefer to get punched in the face once. Offense didn't leave Jake also, because Ray wasn't satisfied with just laughing at the newcomer. He had brought some man with him, maybe that same old friend Valerie. Dressed in a gray, worn duster, the man stood behind Ray and, echoing Jake's partner's laughter, quietly smirked. "Enough laughing already. Let me meet your friend," Jake said, nodding behind the second guard's back. "Oh, right, I forgot to introduce you," the unfamiliar man said, taking a step and barely noticeably pushing Ray, who immediately hunched over. Something hot and viscous splashed into Jake's face. Deathly pale, Ray slowly opened his mouth, as if he had just woken up and, yawning, was hastening his awakening. A thin stream of blood flowed from his lips. Focusing his gaze, Jake saw that the tip of a wide knife, colored red with blood, was sticking out of Ray's chest. With a barely audible squelch, the blade disappeared into Ray's lifeless body, and a moment later the corpse leaned against the door and slid down. The stranger smirked. His pale blue, almost colorless eyes were cold and burned the soul with unbearable coldness. He looked at Ray's corpse, then at Jake, clearly anticipating some perverted pleasure he intended to give himself. Transferring the knife to his right hand, the stranger stepped over the body at his feet. Jake's holster had been unsnapped even before the cruel denouement with Ray. From the hidden corners of his memory emerged the army training he had learned. Private Parker, ready to fire. When taking the speed test, exactly 3 cartridges were allotted to Private Parker. If by the end of his service he had learned to fit into the allotted time, accuracy always limped on both legs. But now there weren't 3 cartridges in the clip. The distance to the enemy, although frightening in its insignificance, played into his hands, hardly giving him a chance to miss from 5 feet. Besides, now Jake wasn't being hurried by a shooting instructor. The desire to survive does this much better than any army specialist. Jake restored his breathing, stepped back, aimed exactly at the center, exactly smoothly. The stranger lunged at Jake, who fired his entire clip into his opponent at short intervals. The first bullets hit the chest, they stopped the killer, threw him back. The next shots, when the guard caught the enemy's head in his sights, pierced the man's neck and left cheek. Jake fired the last bullet into his opponent's knee. "Now we'll figure this out. Now we'll figure this out," Jake muttered under his breath, dragging Ray's corpse inside and hastily locking the door in case the attacker wasn't alone. "We'll sort this out now. We'll report where we need to. They'll come quickly," the guard reassured himself. The adrenaline shot finished its effect, and his heart hadn't stopped pounding like a soldier coming out of battle, but he already had control over his hands. They were shaking, preventing him from handcuffing the killer and tying him with a belt. Jake often had to hear about murders and accidents when using non-lethal weapons. Someone was shot, someone played around until they visited the Grim Reaper. Whether it was about other pistols, more powerful ones, or whether the tied-up man in the gray duster lying at the guard's feet was made of cast iron, nothing else could explain why the shots had stopped him, but hadn't caused any significant harm. There were black bruises on his neck, a long blue furrow on his left cheek that wasn't even bleeding. However, the bullets from the non-lethal pistol had still knocked the wind out of Ray's killer, and the enemy lay unconscious, not thinking about resisting. Jake spun around the small room, remembering that the panic button he so needed was only at the first post left by Ray. He could only call for help by mobile phone. The guard, who had never called emergency services from a mobile phone, was completely lost. There had never been a need. He wasn't familiar with the numbers, and when the need arose, everything was erased from his head in one moment. But it's not 911. Out of anger at himself, he was about to slam his hand on the table when his gaze fell on the memo pressed to the desktop under glass numbers including the Unified Emergency Service, the telephone of the duty department of the Regional Security Department, and even emergency services. In the corner, the killer stirred. Jake, who had inserted a new clip into his pistol, quickly turned his whole body and aimed at his opponent. Dialing the emergency service number, the guard noticed a wound on the man's leg. The trouser leg from the knee down was soaked with blood. Immediately, the mobile phone went silent. There were no connection beeps. Taking the phone away from his ear, the guard looked at the lit screen, wanted to bring the mobile to his ear again. The screen blinked. The image of the green, trembling handset spread into tiny dots and disappeared forever. "No one will hear you," said the one lying on the floor, who had a strange voice, as if coming from deep in his stomach, continuing to brazenly smirk at something of his own. No one will save you. The others will come soon." The guard looked out the window, and immediately the lantern above the booth, where he was trembling with fear, went out. Like a gunshot, the lamp burst. Its fragments scattered and rustled on the gravel path, plunging into darkness everywhere. Jake didn't recognize the guarded territory. Instead of the warehouses he had grown accustomed to observing during the week, something was swaying. Cold ran down his spine when Jake thought he saw something large moving in his direction. This something was literally dragging behind it impenetrable night that previously came to the Oregon lands only in winter. In the window's reflection, the guard saw the killer silently rising to his feet, and for the first time in his life, felt what it was like when the hair on your head moves from horror. Seeing the true appearance of his opponent, the creature in reality bore very little resemblance to a human. It was faceless and had an enormous head, as if swollen from dropsy. In the gaping, never-closing maw of the creature, there were no teeth. They were replaced by crooked bone growths protruding in several rows at the wide, bloody throat. From these places came the voice of the beast. "We left long ago to return after many years. But these lands no longer belong to us. Thousands of years before our return, other gods, not yours, brought my people here and gave us the land of eternal ice. We settled here and lived until your ancestors came to destroy us. The ancient priests knew how to awaken our gods and ask for protection. We coped with the invasion, sending fierce winter in the middle of summer, destroying your livestock and spreading diseases among people. But you drove us out, drove us away. You destroyed our sanctuaries, depriving us of strength, forcing us to hide and lurk in dungeons where even in the hottest years the ice doesn't melt. Your ancestors locked up my people, and now you yourselves have opened the door and released us." The handcuffs clinked on the floor. Jake looked at the thin creature, propping up the ceiling with its disproportionately huge head. The sharp growths in its maw clicked and scraped against each other with a disgusting sound. The creature's eyes sank inward. The edges of the furrow on the left half of its face spread apart. From the opened wounds crawled out dozens of long purple worms with pale blue eyes swaying at their ends. "What did you see outside the window?" asked the creature, picking up its knife from the floor. It clearly intended to attack the guard again. "You didn't understand who it was. Know that the ancient priests have emerged. They're coming for you. The sleeping gods need a sacrifice to wake up and help their people." Not waiting for an attack, Jake twice shot the creature in the legs, hoping this would force the being to delay. The monster shrieked piercingly, painfully hitting his ears. Jake had no time for this. With a chair, he broke the window and jumped out. From the path, the guy ran, raced without stopping, and completely not recognizing the terrain that surrounded him from all sides. It seemed to him that nothing remained of the warehouses, and under his feet there was neither gravel nor asphalt, only a narrow trail cut by tree roots. Jake imagined that together with the cold night, acting in concert with it, a dark and terrible forest was advancing. His strength was rapidly leaving him. He fell, either catching on something or from weakness in his legs. And instantly he howled with pain, feeling how a fragment of window glass, which Jake hadn't noticed before, sank into his thigh almost to the bone. He couldn't see how blood was fountaining from the artery. Jake's gaze was riveted to 6 figures, tall and thin like ship masts, that had approached and frozen near him. On the bodies of the ancient priests glowed incomprehensible patterns and inscriptions, the secrets of which were never revealed to mere mortals. The faceless ones bent over Jake, reading a terrible prayer in muffled, grave voices in a chant glorifying their awakening gods. The security guard shrugged, a 50-year-old guard. "Yes, you had to know Ray too." The guard with a beard, not much younger than the first, nodded. "You can't speak ill of the dead. Only the truth about the dead," wisdom flashed from the bearded one. This Ray of yours was quite the overgrown blockhead. I was on duty with him back at the base. He could shake your soul out with his tedium. And when he started teaching, well, you don't kill someone for that, objected the first. No matter what a bore Ray was, so someone stuck a knife in his back. Do you think it was because of his chatter? Not because of chatter, agreed the bearded one, and decided to show that he had lost interest in the topic of conversation. They'll figure it all out without us. How it happened there isn't our business. Both guards turned their attention to a tall, stooped man walking along the fence, enthusiastically following the movements of dump trucks and the running around of construction workers on the territory. They wanted to call out to the stranger, but he addressed them first. Good day, guys. Your work here is no joke, as I can see. What are they doing filling in the hole from the old lab? Second day. Machines are hauling earth, sand, and stones, the first guard readily replied. Well, may God help you, the man nodded. But contrary to expectations, he didn't go anywhere, he just stood by the fence, watching. This isn't about work by any chance? Asked the bearded guard. No, I recently. The stranger squinted his pale blue eyes, made a grimace, but couldn't find how to explain accessibly. Just got out recently. The bearded one voiced his guess, immediately becoming serious. Yes, recently got out, the stranger responded. They don't take people with records. The man in the gray duster spread his hands, as if deliberately demonstrating his dirty pants with holes at the knees. He turned around and, limping, headed toward the forest, which for some reason seemed so cold and gloomy to the guards, darker than usual. Well then, dear friends, that's how the story about the security guard ends. Write your opinions in the comments, and to the residents of Portland, I send huge greetings. We'll hear each other again, as always, in the next interesting story. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as the three young men stood awkwardly in the cramped security office. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and cigarettes, and somewhere in the distance, a ventilation system hummed its mechanical lullaby. So what exactly are we supposed to do? They told us everything would be explained on site, Marcus asked, crossing his arms over his chest. His irritation was barely contained behind his forced smile. Who told you that? Chuck, the day shift guard, looked up from his newspaper with obvious annoyance. His belly strained against his uniform shirt, and his small eyes squinted with suspicion. Management, Jake added quickly. They said we'd get full training here. Chuck let out a bitter laugh that turned into a wheezing cough. Training? Boys, do you see what time it is? 8 o'clock in the evening. My shift ends in 1 hour, and I couldn't care less about training anyone. Nobody pays me extra to babysit newcomers. Folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness. How did you three even get hired anyway? Same as everyone, I guess, Tyler spoke up for the first time. Saw the job posting online, called the number, came in for a quick interview. They gave us these uniforms and told us to report here tonight. Said everything else would be handled on location. Chuck shook his head in disbelief. Any of you ever worked security before? Silence filled the room. The three exchanged glances, but nobody spoke. Of course not. Chuck heaved himself out of his chair with a grunt. 3 farm boys from God knows where, coming to the big city to make their fortune. He grabbed a set of keys from a pegboard on the wall. Well, here's your crash course in warehouse security. He pointed to an old rotary phone sitting next to a bank of security monitors. That's your lifeline. Emergency numbers are taped right there next to the screens. Fire department, police, ambulance. You'll probably need at least one of those before morning. Tyler's face went pale. What do you mean? Chuck ignored the question and continued his lackluster tour. These keys, he jangled them in the air, lock the main entrances. The warehouse closes at 10. After that, you kick out anyone who's still inside and lock up tight. What you do after that is your business. Where are we supposed to sleep? Jake asked. Management said there would be accommodations. Sleep. Chuck's eyebrows shot up. You think this is a hotel? Look around, genius. You see any beds? You can sleep on the floor for all I care. Marcus stepped forward, his jaw clenched. But they told us. Management tells people a lot of things, Chuck interrupted. Doesn't mean any of it's true. Look, during the day, I sit here and watch these monitors while 2 other guys walk the floors. Simple enough. But at night, that's your problem to figure out. He grabbed his jacket from a hook on the wall and shrugged it into it. And boys, word of advice, don't try to steal anything. This place is wired with cameras everywhere. You try to walk out with so much as a paper clip, and you'll be wearing orange jumpsuits by morning. We're not thieves, Tyler said quietly. Sure you're not. Chuck's smile was cold and knowing. Well, gentlemen, I've got a date with a cold beer and a hot burger. Try not to burn the place down. The 3 young men watched him lumber toward the door, his keys jingling with each heavy step. Why does he treat us like dogs? Marcus muttered, staring at the door Chuck had just walked through. I spent my last $100 getting here, and now these people act like they're doing us some kind of favor. Maybe we can make this work, Tyler said, trying to sound optimistic. He found an old coffee pot and started rummaging through the cabinets. At least we've got shelter for the night. Yeah, until that fat pig comes back tomorrow and kicks us out, Jake said. He made it pretty clear we're not welcome here during the day. Marcus slumped into Chuck's abandoned chair. This whole thing is a disaster. They promised us housing, training, decent pay. Now we're basically homeless security guards in a warehouse we know nothing about. Tyler found some instant coffee and started making a pot. The familiar ritual seemed to calm his nerves slightly. Well, we're here now. Might as well make the best of it. Make the best of it. Jake pulled a small bottle from his duffel bag. You know what? I think I'll make the best of it in my own way. He twisted off the cap and took a long pull of clear liquid. Is that moonshine? Marcus perked up, momentarily forgetting his troubles. The finest white lightning Tennessee has to offer, Jake grinned. Want some? Though I guess we're technically on duty. Duty, Tyler laughed bitterly. They promised us housing, meal plans, even transportation. You really think I'm going to stand around guarding their precious warehouse after they lied to us about everything? Marcus stood up and walked to the window overlooking the main floor. Row upon row of metal shelving stretched into the darkness, filled with pallets of goods wrapped in plastic. Somewhere in the distance, automatic systems hummed and clicked as they maintained temperature and humidity levels. You know what? Marcus turned back to his companions. Jake's right. Why should we break our backs for people who don't even respect us enough to tell us the truth? He looked at the bottle in Jake's hand. Maybe I will have some of that. Tyler joined them, accepting the bottle when it was passed his way. The alcohol burned going down, but it felt good. It felt like rebellion. So what's the plan? Jake asked, leaning back in his chair. We could just walk out right now. Catch the next bus home and forget this whole disaster. Or, Tyler said slowly, an idea forming in his mind, we could make this trip worth our while. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Think about it, we've got keys to this entire place. Security cameras we could disable. Loading docks with direct access to the highway. Tyler's voice dropped to a whisper. Chuck said they didn't even check our references or copy our IDs. For all they know, we could be anybody. Jake sat up straighter. You're talking about robbing the place. I'm talking about getting what we were promised, Tyler corrected. They want to treat us like criminals anyway. Maybe it's time we acted like it. Marcus looked uncomfortable. I don't know, guys. That's serious jail time if we get caught. Who's going to catch us? Tyler spread his arms wide. Look around. It's just us and whatever's in those storage areas. We take what we can carry, lock up behind us, and disappear. By the time anyone figures out what happened, we'll be 3 states away. Jake nodded slowly. He's got a point. And honestly, after the way they've treated us, I don't feel bad about it. What about the cameras? Marcus asked. I used to work construction, Tyler said. I know enough about electrical systems to cause some problems. Besides, power outages happen all the time in places like this. The three men sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the warehouse floor. All right, Marcus finally said. But first, let's do that security walk Chuck mentioned. I want to see what we're dealing with here. They finished their impromptu drinks and stood up, stretching muscles that had been cramped from the long bus ride to the city. The warehouse was massive, easily the size of several city blocks, with 2 full levels of storage and a maze of corridors connecting different sections. Let's split up, Tyler suggested. Cover more ground that way. We'll meet back here in an hour and compare notes. Jake grabbed a flashlight from the security desk. Sounds good. If anyone's still here past closing time, we'll deal with them. Marcus headed toward the eastern wing, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floors. The warehouse was even bigger than he'd initially thought, with sections devoted to everything from electronics to clothing to industrial equipment. As he walked, his stomach began to cramp painfully. When was the last time he'd eaten? Yesterday morning, maybe. The bus ride had been over 12 hours, and he'd been too nervous to eat much before leaving home. Then the confusion of navigating the city's public transportation system, followed by hours of waiting in the employment office for paperwork that never came. His stomach growled audibly in the quiet space. Great job, Marcus, he muttered to himself. Come to the big city to make your fortune, end up starving in a warehouse. But that was about to change. In a few hours, he'd have enough merchandise to keep him comfortable for months. Electronics, maybe some jewelry if this place stored that kind of thing. Enough to make this whole nightmare worth it. He was so focused on his plans that he almost didn't notice the figure at first. Someone was standing in the middle of the aisle, hunched over what looked like a large canvas bag. In the dim emergency lighting, Marcus couldn't make out many details, but whoever it was seemed to be struggling with something heavy. Hey, Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the empty space. House is closed. You need to leave. The figure stopped moving but didn't respond. Didn't even look up. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the person's posture was wrong. Too still, too rigid. I said the warehouse is closed, Marcus repeated, louder this time. He started walking toward the figure, his hand instinctively clenching into a fist. They hadn't given him a weapon, not even pepper spray. If this turned into a confrontation, he'd have to rely on size and attitude. The person finally looked up, and Marcus's blood turned to ice. The face that turned toward him wasn't entirely human anymore. The eyes were gone, replaced by dark, wet holes that seemed to weep constantly. The cheeks had rotted away, exposing yellowed teeth in a permanent grin. And the nose had been pushed so far back into the skull that it barely existed. Marcus opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the spot by pure terror. The thing that had once been human stood up slowly, revealing its full height. It was wearing normal clothes, jeans, and a work shirt, but there was something wrong with its proportions. The arms were too long, and as it moved closer, Marcus could see why. It had a third arm. The extra limb grew from its torso, long and unnaturally jointed, ending in fingers that were more like claws. As Marcus watched in frozen horror, those claws reached out and sank into his belly with surgical precision. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus looked down to see his own intestines spilling onto the warehouse floor, steaming in the cool air. He tried to push the thing away, tried to fight back, but his strength was flowing out of him along with his blood. The creature's ruined face came close to his, and he could smell the rot, could hear the wet sounds it made as it breathed through the holes where its nose should have been. "Please," Marcus whispered, but the word came out as barely a whisper. Thing tilted its head, almost curious, then opened its mouth wide and bit down on Marcus's throat. Jake was examining a pallet of computer equipment when he heard what might have been a scream. The sound was distant and brief, cut off almost as soon as it started, but it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He paused in his inventory, listening carefully to the ambient sounds of the warehouse. Ventilation systems, the hum of refrigeration units, the occasional creak of metal settling. Nothing that sounded human, but Jake had grown up in rural Tennessee, son of a man who made his living hunting everything from deer to wild boar. He knew the sounds that prey made when predators found them. He knew what fear sounded like and what death sounded like, and he was pretty sure he'd just heard both. Jake set down the laptop he'd been examining and moved toward the sound source. His hunting instincts, dormant during his years in the city, suddenly came roaring back to life. Move quietly. Stay alert. Trust your gut when it tells you something's wrong. His gut was screaming warnings right now. From his position on the warehouse's second level, Jake had a good view of the main floor. He moved to the railing and scanned the aisles below, looking for any sign of movement. At first, he saw nothing. Then, in the distance, he caught sight of something being dragged across the floor. Something large and dark, leaving a wet trail behind it. Jake's mouth went dry. Whatever was down there, it wasn't human. No human moved like that, with that jerky, unnatural gait. And no human would be dragging something that size around a warehouse after hours. Every instinct told him to run. Get to the security office, call the police, get the hell out of this place. But another part of him, the part that had learned to track wounded animals through dense forest, was curious. What exactly was he looking at? He found a good hiding spot behind a support beam and settled in to watch. From here, he could see without being seen. At least he hoped so. His father had taught him that some animals, especially the dangerous ones, could sense when they were being watched. The smart move was to observe without making direct eye contact. The thing below had stopped dragging its burden and was now standing perfectly still in the middle of an aisle. Jake couldn't make out many details from this distance, but there was something profoundly wrong about its silhouette. The proportions were off, like someone had taken a human form and stretched it in all the wrong directions. The smell hit him next. Even from 2 floors up, he could detect the unmistakable odor of blood and something else. Something rotten. Jake forced himself to breathe slowly and quietly. Whatever was down there, it was dangerous, extremely dangerous, and if his suspicions were correct, it had just killed Marcus. The creature stood motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. And without warning, it moved with frightening speed toward the warehouse's main electrical panel. Jake watched in horror as the lights went out one by one. Emergency lighting kicked in briefly, then that too went dark. The warehouse plunged into absolute blackness. In the darkness, Jake heard sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Wet, tearing noises, something heavy being moved, and underneath it all, a sound that might have been laughter if it had come from a human throat. Tyler had been having the time of his life exploring the warehouse's electronics section when the lights went out. He'd found pallets of smartphones, tablets, gaming consoles, all the high-end merchandise that would be easy to fence in any major city. Jackpot, he whispered to himself, stuffing his pockets with anything small and valuable. But when the emergency lighting failed and left him in total darkness, his mood changed quickly. This wasn't a normal power outage. Someone or something had deliberately killed the electricity. Tyler fumbled for his phone, using its flashlight app to illuminate his immediate surroundings. The small circle of light seemed pathetically inadequate in the vast darkness of the warehouse. He needed to get back to the security office, needed to find Jake and Marcus. They could figure out what was happening and decide their next move together. But as he started toward what he hoped was the right direction, Tyler heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. He turned off his phone's light and stood perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Tyler waited, counting heartbeats. 30 seconds, a minute, nothing. Carefully, he turned the light back on and started moving again. He'd only taken a few steps when he heard the footsteps resume, closer this time. "Marcus, Jake," he called out softly. "Is that you guys?" The footsteps stopped again. Tyler's hands were shaking now, making the phone's light dance wildly across the warehouse shelving. He tried to remember the layout, tried to figure out which direction would take him back to safety. Then he heard a voice. Marcus's voice. "Tyler, over here, man. We need to stick together." Relief flooded through Tyler's system. "Marcus, thank God, where are you?" "Just follow my voice," the Marcus voice said. "I'm by the loading dock." But something was wrong. The voice was too flat, too emotionless. And there was something underneath it, like an echo or a recording played at the wrong speed. Tyler had known Marcus for less than a day, but he'd heard him speak for hours during their bus ride. This wasn't quite right. "Where's Jake?" Tyler asked, not moving toward the voice. "He's here too," the voice replied. "We're both here. Come on, Tyler. Don't make us come looking for you." Now Tyler was sure. Whatever was speaking wasn't Marcus. The cadence was wrong. The tone was wrong. Everything about it was a grotesque imitation. Tyler turned and ran in the opposite direction, his phone's light bouncing wildly as he sprinted between storage racks. Behind him, he heard the thing that wasn't Marcus let out a sound that was part laugh and part shriek. He could hear it following him, moving through the darkness with impossible speed. Tyler ran blindly, turning corners at random, hoping to lose his pursuer in the maze of storage aisles. His lungs burned and his legs ached, but he didn't dare stop. Whatever was chasing him wasn't human, and it definitely wasn't friendly. Tyler found himself in a section of the warehouse that stored office supplies. He ducked behind a pallet of copy paper and turned off his phone, plunging himself into darkness. His pursuer's footsteps echoed through the warehouse, sometimes close, sometimes distant. It seemed to be searching for him methodically, checking each aisle. Tyler tried to control his breathing, tried to make himself as small and quiet as possible. His heart was pounding so loud he was sure it would give him away. Then the footsteps stopped right outside his hiding place. Tyler held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed. He could hear something breathing just a few feet away, but it didn't sound like human breathing. It was wet and ragged, like air being forced through damaged tissue. "Tyler," the thing whispered in Marcus's voice. "I know you're here. Why don't you come out so we can talk?" Tyler squeezed his eyes shut and prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped. The footsteps resumed. Moving away from his hiding spot, Tyler waited until he couldn't hear anything except his own heartbeat before he dared to move. When he finally turned his phone back on, he was alone. But he knew the thing was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, still hunting. Jake had watched the creature's hunt from his perch on the second level, using the brief flashes of Tyler's phone light to track the pursuit through the warehouse. What he saw convinced him that his friends were dead, and that he would be too if he didn't find a way out. The thing moved like nothing Jake had ever seen. It was fast, impossibly fast, but it also seemed to know the warehouse layout better than any of them did. It moved through the darkness with confidence, never bumping into obstacles, never hesitating at intersections. When Tyler's light finally went out and stayed out, Jake assumed the worst. He was on his own now. Jake's hunting experience had taught him patience, but it had also taught him when to act decisively. Right now, he needed help, and the only way to get it was to reach that security phone. The security office was on the ground floor, about 50 yards from his current position. In normal circumstances, it would be a quick walk. In absolute darkness, with a monster somewhere below, it might as well have been on the moon. But Jake had one advantage. He knew how to move silently in the dark. Years of pre-dawn hunting trips had taught him to navigate by touch and sound, to move without making noise. He started down the stairs, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The metal creaked slightly, but the sound was masked by the warehouse's ambient noise. Jake reached the main floor and began working his way toward the security office. He stayed close to the walls when possible, using them to guide his direction. Every few steps, he stopped and listened. The warehouse felt different now. It wasn't just dark, it felt malevolent, like the building itself had become something predatory. Jake was halfway to his destination when he heard Tyler scream. The sound was brief but unmistakable. It came from somewhere behind him, back in the storage areas he'd just left. It was the sound of someone in mortal terror, then silence. Jake forced himself to keep moving toward the security office. He couldn't help Tyler now, but maybe he could still save himself. He reached the office door and felt around for the handle. Locked. Of course it was locked. Chuck probably had the only key, but the door was old and the lock was just a simple deadbolt. Jake had broken into enough deer camps and hunting cabins to know how to deal with this kind of obstacle. He found a credit card in his wallet and worked it into the door frame. It took several minutes of careful manipulation, but finally he heard the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. Jake slipped inside and immediately locked the door behind him. The security office had no windows, so he risked turning on the lights. Familiar surroundings were almost reassuring after the horror of the warehouse floor. Jake grabbed the phone and dialed 911. Nothing. No dial tone, no connection. The line was dead. Jake checked the phone's connection to the wall. Everything looked normal, but clearly something had been cut or disconnected. He tried his cell phone next, but there was no signal. Not unusual in a building this size, with this much metal construction. Jake was truly on his own. He turned his attention to the security monitors, hoping to get some idea of what he was dealing with. Most of the screens showed nothing but static, but a few were still functioning on battery backup power. What Jake saw on those screens made his blood freeze. The creature was in the corridor just outside the security office. It was standing perfectly still, staring directly into the camera. And clutched in its mutated third arm was what looked like Tyler's severed head. As Jake watched in horror, the thing tilted Tyler's head and moved the mouth like a puppet. "Jake," Tyler's dead lips seemed to say, though no sound came through the monitors. "Come out and play, Jake." Jake stumbled backward from the monitors, his stomach churning. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. The thing on the screen seemed to sense his reaction. It held Tyler's head higher, making the mouth move in what might have been a smile. Then it disappeared from the camera's view. Jake spun around to stare at the office door. The lock he'd broken to get in wouldn't keep anything out, especially not something that could kill two grown men with its bare hands. He needed a better barricade. Jake started pushing furniture against the door. The desk, filing cabinets, anything heavy enough to slow down an intruder. It wouldn't stop the creature, but it might buy him some time. As he worked, Jake could hear sounds from the corridor outside. Scratching, like claws on metal. Something being dragged across the floor. And underneath it all, a sound that might have been humming. The thing was playing with him. Jake finished his barricade and retreated to the far corner of the office. He had no weapons, no way to communicate with the outside world, and no exit except the door he just blocked. All he could do was wait for dawn, and hope the creature would disappear with the daylight. It was going to be a long night. The creature spent hours outside the security office, alternately silent and active. Sometimes Jake could hear it moving around, dragging things, rearranging objects. Other times it would be perfectly quiet for so long that Jake wondered if it had left. But whenever he started to hope he was alone, the thing would make some noise to remind him it was still there. The worst part was the voices, using Marcus's voice. "Jake, buddy, why don't you open up? We need to talk about what happened tonight." Using Tyler's voice. "Come on, man, we're all friends here. No need to hide." Sometimes it mixed them up, starting sentences in one voice and finishing in another. The effect was nauseating, like listening to a broken recording of his dead friends. Jake pressed his hands over his ears and tried to block out the sounds, but the creature seemed to know when he was listening and when he wasn't. It would go silent until he relaxed, then start up again with renewed vigor. Dawn seemed like it would never come. When the first gray light finally began filtering through the warehouse's high windows, the sounds outside the office gradually stopped. Jake waited another hour before he dared to move the barricade and crack open the door. The corridor was empty. Jake emerged cautiously, looking for any sign of the creature or his friends. The warehouse looked normal in the daylight, just rows of storage racks and pallets of merchandise. If not for the bloodstains on the floor, he might have convinced himself the whole thing had been a nightmare. But the blood was real. Dark, dried patches that marked the spots where Marcus and Tyler had died. Jake was examining one of the stains when he heard vehicles outside. Car doors slamming, voices calling to each other. Help was arriving. But as the warehouse's main door opened and Chuck walked in, followed by a cleaning crew, Jake realized that his problems were far from over. Chuck saw him immediately and his face went pale. "What are you still doing here? There was something in here last night," Jake said, pointing to the bloodstains. "Some kind of creature. It killed Marcus and Tyler." Chuck's expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been guilt. "I don't know what you're talking about. Look at the blood." Jake gestured frantically at the evidence. "Look at what's left of them." The cleaning crew was already setting up their equipment, seemingly unsurprised by the carnage. They worked with the efficiency of people who had cleaned up scenes like this before. "You're in shock," Chuck said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes people see things when they're scared." Jake grabbed Chuck by the shirt and pulled him close. You knew something was in here and you sent us in anyway." Chuck tried to pull away, but Jake's grip was iron strong. Months of physical labor had given him strength, and righteous fury had given him purpose. "I didn't know anything specific," Chuck protested. "Management just said the night shift had special requirements." Special requirements. "Look, they don't pay me enough to ask questions. They needed people for the night shift, people who wouldn't be missed if things went wrong." Chuck's face was pale and sweaty. "Drifters, guys without families, people who came from out of state." Jake's grip tightened. "What is that thing?" "I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what it is. Management calls it security, but it's not like any security I've ever seen." Chuck was babbling now, terrified. "They said it keeps thieves away, that it protects the warehouse at night. And it has to be fed." Chuck nodded miserably. "That's why they hire people like you, people who won't be missed." Jake looked around at the cleaning crew, who were working methodically to remove all traces of the previous night's horror. They wore uniforms with a corporate logo he didn't recognize, and they worked without speaking, like they'd done this many times before. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," Chuck whispered. "They bring in new people every few months. Sometimes the night shift lasts longer, sometimes not. Depends on how hungry it gets." Jake released Chuck and stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just murder, it was systematic, corporate-sponsored murder. Somewhere in a boardroom, Executives had decided that feeding people to a monster was a cost-effective security measure. The cleaning crew was almost finished. Soon there would be no evidence that Marcus and Tyler had ever existed. Jake made his decision. He grabbed Chuck and drove his fist into the older man's face. Chuck went down hard, his head striking the concrete floor with a wet crack. Jake didn't stop there. Years of anger and frustration, amplified by grief and horror, poured out of him in a torrent of violence. He beat Chuck until the man stopped moving, until his face was unrecognizable, until the rage finally burned itself out. When Jake finally stood up, the cleaning crew was watching him with professional interest. They didn't seem shocked or horrified. If anything, they looked bored. "Will you be needing our services for this as well?" one of them asked politely. Jake stared at them for a moment, then started laughing. The sound echoed through the warehouse, high and hysterical. "No," he said finally. "I think I'll leave this one for the day shift to find." Jake walked toward the exit, stepping over Chuck's body without a second glance. He had a bus to catch, a story to tell, and a corporation to expose. Behind him, the cleaning crew went back to work, erasing the last traces of Marcus and Tyler from the world. But they couldn't erase Jake's memory, and they couldn't silence his voice. The warehouse's secret was about to become very public indeed. I had worked at Millfield Medical Center for about 2 years as a security guard, and in that time, I'd seen plenty of strange things. The facility was old, really old, built back in the 1920s when they had different ideas about treating mental health patients. While it was still an active medical center, the place carried the weight of its history in every creaking floorboard and shadowy corridor. The center was set up like a small campus, with multiple buildings scattered across rolling hills that stretched down to Lake Huron, the second largest of the Great Lakes. Underground tunnels connected all the buildings, a remnant from the days when patients weren't allowed outside during certain seasons. The lake access was about a mile down a winding forest road that cut through dense woodland, creating a natural canopy so thick that even on sunny days, very little light made it through. As you drove down that road, you passed reminders of the facility's darker past. First, there was an old wooden tower, maybe 30 feet tall, that patients used to climb for exercise back when they had more freedom. About a quarter-mile further was the old cemetery, where patients who had no family to claim them were buried. Simple stone markers, most worn smooth by decades of weather, stretched across a small clearing among the trees. The road ended at a clearing where it met state park land. There were picnic tables, a small bathroom building, a fishing dock, and a beautiful view of the lake. A hiking trail connected this spot to a public parking area, which sometimes made my job complicated because teenagers would park at the public lot and hike in after dark to explore our grounds. After catching several groups of kids where they shouldn't be, some got smart and started parking even further away to avoid detection. This meant our security rounds now included checking both the public parking area and the state park section to monitor which cars were there, noting their license plates, and timing how long they stayed. It was a nice little park, but there really wasn't much reason to spend more than a couple hours there, especially if you arrived near sunset. One night while doing my rounds, I decided to park in the woods just up from the old cemetery. It was so dark that without headlights, you could barely make out the shapes of trees even a few feet away. But I found it peaceful sitting on the hood of my patrol van, the only light coming from moonlight reflecting off the lake's surface. It was spooky being alone in the dark woods, but most of the time it felt calming rather than threatening. As a bonus, if I quickly flashed my light toward the base of nearby trees, I'd often spot families of raccoons foraging for food. They were absolutely adorable to watch. On this particular night, I was sitting on the hood listening to owl calls and the gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore when I heard a sharp crack from behind me. It was so loud and sudden that it felt like a branch had snapped right next to my head. Since I was parked on the road about 10 feet from the nearest tree, that couldn't be right. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and started scanning the area where I thought the sound had come from. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer that had stepped on a fallen branch, even though something felt off about it. The sound had been far too loud for something as careful and graceful as a deer to make. I climbed back onto the hood and kept my flashlight ready. If someone was trespassing, I wouldn't be caught off guard again. Some time passed, and I'd almost convinced myself it really had been just a clumsy deer when I heard another sharp crack. This time I jumped down immediately, turning on my flashlight as my feet hit the ground and aiming it directly where the noise had come from. Again, nothing. I swept the area carefully with my light. There was no way anything could have hidden that quickly given how close the sound had been. Even if it was a deer or some other animal, I should have seen it or at least heard it running away. But as I stood there completely puzzled, there was nothing but silence. Determined to figure out what was happening, I walked toward the tree line looking for tracks, broken branches, or disturbed leaves. At the very least, I hoped my flashlight would catch the reflection from an animal's eyes, so I could get back to enjoying the peaceful lake until my next round of checks. I didn't realize how far I'd wandered into the woods until I looked back and couldn't see the road anymore. That was pretty foolish if it really was a person messing with me. I decided to turn around, but in the darkness, even my flashlight couldn't penetrate far enough to show me the way back. I aimed it lower so I could at least follow the path I'd made going in. As I focused on retracing my steps, I was suddenly hit with the unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. It started as a creeping sensation at the back of my neck and spread down my spine like ice water. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel panic starting to build. I knew something was behind me, something just waiting. It felt like at any moment, a hand would reach out and grab me, or whatever was stalking me would pounce. I forced myself to stay as composed as possible, ready to fight if I had to. I convinced myself that if I turned around to look, I'd be attacked, so I just needed to get back to the road. Keeping my flashlight pointed at my trail, I started moving faster. I had to be close to the road by now, close to the safety of my van. I was starting to feel hopeful when my bouncing light caught the reflection of my security vehicle's emblem, and then thwack. Something sharp struck me in the head. It wasn't a hard blow, but something had definitely cut the top of my scalp, and I could feel warm blood starting to trickle through my hair. I spun around to see what had attacked me, and my light caught something pale and white hanging from a low tree branch. It was an old deer skull, deliberately positioned to hang at about head height. Most of the flesh had rotted away, except for some dried remains around the eye sockets. The teeth were mostly intact, and in the harsh glare of my flashlight, it almost looked like it was grinning at me. I could see it still had one antler attached, which must have been what cut my head. I felt like I'd been staring at that skull forever when I finally snapped out of my shock, only to hear footsteps coming from deep in the woods behind me. They started slow, but gradually picked up speed until it sounded like whoever it was had broken into a full sprint. Branches snapped and leaves crunched as the footsteps got closer and closer. I didn't hesitate. I took off running toward my van as fast as I could. I could hear them gaining on me, close enough now that I could hear heavy breathing. As my feet hit the gravel road, I strained to listen for when they would reach the road too, for the sound of branches breaking to change to the sound of heavy footsteps on loose gravel. I only had about 20 feet to reach my van, but if they were too close, They could easily catch me before I got the door open. I thought about just running down the road so I could radio for help, but I worried that pulling out my radio would slow me down too much, giving my pursuer the chance to close the distance. Plus, who was going to help me? I had the only vehicle out here. The communication room was staffed by elderly ladies who probably couldn't do much even if they called for backup. And by the time anyone arrived, it would be far too late. I made my choice and gave everything I had to reach the van. I thanked my habit of occasionally forgetting to lock it as I threw the door open, jumped inside, and hit the locks. I fumbled for my keys and started the engine, backing up and pointing the headlights toward where I'd emerged from the woods, hoping to catch whoever had been chasing me as they came out of the tree line. Then it hit me. I'd never heard them reach the road. It felt like they'd been right behind me, but there was no one there for me to see. I caught my breath and gently touched my head, wincing when I pulled my hand back and saw blood on my fingers. It didn't seem like a serious cut, but head wounds tend to bleed heavily, so I could only imagine how my light brown hair would look when I checked back in at the main facility. I didn't radio in. I didn't do anything except sit and stare at the spot where I'd come out of the woods. I sat there until my heavy breathing calmed and my heart rate returned to normal. Once again, there was nothing there, but I knew that wasn't right. I know what I heard and what I felt. It had to be similar to what that deer experienced at some point, the feeling of being hunted. While I sat there trying to process what had happened, I started thinking about how that deer's skull could have ended up hanging there. Maybe a large bird of prey had been scavenging and dropped it. Maybe an ambitious raccoon had tried to drag it up to its den, and it got stuck. Then it dawned on me. I had followed my own path back out, which meant the skull wasn't there when I walked in, or I would have hid it on my way into the woods. It was also close enough to the road that even now, with my headlights on, I could see it clearly hanging there, which meant I should have noticed it when I first scanned the tree line. My skin began to crawl as goosebumps broke out all over my arms. Whoever had been out there must have been hiding behind me the whole time, managing to stay quiet enough to hang that skull while I was distracted. But if they were trying to lure me deeper into the woods, how had they gotten so far back there to chase me out? Unless there were two of them, and my van had been unlocked the entire time. A horrible thought flashed through my mind, and I jumped out of the vehicle. I pulled out my radio, then stopped. What was I going to say? That I'd made a series of terrible decisions, and was currently stranded outside my vehicle alone in the dark woods with someone potentially hiding nearby, and maybe even in the back of my van instead. I tried this. Unit 7 to Control, I'm at the lakefront area, about to head out to check the schoolhouse. Requesting radio check in 10 minutes. Control to Unit 7, copy that. We'll contact you in 10 minutes. At least now, if things went badly, someone would eventually come looking for me. I slowly made my way to the van's sliding side door. I held my breath and pushed it open. It was automatic, though, so despite wanting to rip the bandage off quickly, it just slowly slid back. I guess we'll both be ready, I muttered as I started to see the back seat. To my relief, there was nothing there. I sighed and closed the door, listening to it slowly slide back to the closed position. I was heading back to the driver's seat when I heard someone behind me start laughing. It was a high-pitched, manic kind of laugh that I thought only existed in comic book movies. I was done. Absolutely and completely done. I didn't wait. I didn't look. I jumped back into the van with the side door still slowly closing and drove off as fast as I could down that winding forest road. I checked my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone come running out into the road, so I could finally get a look at who had been tormenting me for the past hour. No one ever appeared, and that was the end of my peaceful nighttime trips to the lake area. After completing my requested radio check and inspecting the old schoolhouse, I drove back to check the main parking area. There hadn't been any cars there earlier, and there still weren't any in the vicinity. With little else to do and unsure how to proceed, I decided to park at one of the old staff housing buildings. It used to house patients decades ago, but now it was used for employees. Sometimes when bad snowstorms were predicted, staff could stay overnight in these buildings to avoid driving in dangerous weather, and to guarantee there would be personnel on site if needed. I figured there had to be running water there, and I wanted to try washing some of the dried blood out of my hair. I still needed to do my final security check there anyway. As I was doing my impromptu hair washing in the cleanest sink I could find, my radio crackled to life. Control to Unit 7. Unit 7 to Control, what's up? We need you to come by the control room as soon as possible. That wasn't good. I assumed I was in trouble for something, though I couldn't think of what I might have done to warrant being called in like that. I quickly dried my hair as best I could, put it up, cursed my luck, and hurried to the control room. When I entered, I expected to get scolded. Instead, one of the dispatchers waved me over to their control panel. It was set up in a semicircle with all kinds of buttons and screens. Every radio transmission was automatically recorded, and with all the radio chatter from different departments talking to each other, requesting help, or reporting new patients, it was a lot to keep track of. "Were you alone when you radioed about your location at the lake area?" she asked, her expression serious. It was a major violation to have anyone unauthorized with you on the grounds, and it definitely wouldn't look good this late at night. "Of course I was alone," I said defensively, but immediately thought about everything that had happened. Could they hear in my voice that I was panicked? "Well, were you looking for anyone? You know you're supposed to report suspicious activity." She looked at me seriously over her glasses, then added, "You're not in trouble, by the way. I just need to ask before I play this recording for you." I sighed and told her everything except the part about cutting my head and it bleeding. That would have required an incident report, and frankly, I was exhausted and didn't want to deal with more paperwork. It felt good to tell someone the whole story. It had only happened an hour ago, but I could already feel it weighing on me. I was still shaken, and if I got in trouble for not reporting suspicious activity, so be it. I needed to get this off my chest. She nodded, her expression remaining serious. It always seemed like the sweet grandmother type, and seeing her look so stern really put me on edge. "Listen to this," she said, and pressed play. I heard my voice requesting the radio check, then the transmission ended. I looked at her, confused. This didn't seem worth calling me in for. That was the last transmission you sent at that time, correct? "Yeah," I said hesitantly. "Then you responded to our check-in call, and that was the end of the conversation." She shook her head and played another recording that directly followed mine. It was that laugh, that crazy, manic laughter, loud and clear. It blared through their speakers. My blood went cold, and I could feel all the color draining from my face. I looked around at the other dispatchers in the control room, and I could finally see they weren't upset with me. They were scared. I gathered myself and said, "I searched the area thoroughly and found no one." She looked at me, shrugged, and said, "All right," then hit the delete button. I had been working security for my Uncle Frank's company for over 7 years when everything changed. He'd been kind enough to hire me right out of high school. All I needed was to apply for my guard license and buy my own equipment. Working under him had been easy for those 7 years, mostly daytime shifts, where the biggest excitement was asking homeless people not to loiter or go through dumpsters. Occasionally, someone would give me trouble, but the threat of calling police was usually enough to get people to calm down and move along. I'd only gotten into a few actual fights with people who had more attitude than sense, but I always managed to handle it. Pepper spray is an excellent defensive tool, by the way, but everything shifted after my father died from stomach cancer. Life became an uphill battle from that point on. Throughout his illness, I'd been picking up extra shifts, covering for guys who called in sick or just didn't feel like showing up. Uncle Frank's company started struggling financially, so he began looking for new contracts to help us get by during this really difficult time. I did my best juggling work and taking care of Dad at home, until one night he passed away peacefully in his sleep. It tore our family apart losing him. I don't believe in ghosts. I definitely didn't want to. The idea that Dad's spirit might be wandering around after death, lost in some kind of dark afterlife, scared me. After the fight he'd been through, working right up until his final days, I just wanted him to rest in peace. Ghosts were the last thing I wanted to think about. I almost envied that kind of eternal rest. But I still had responsibilities. If not for myself, then for my younger brother, who I now had to help take care of alone. So when Uncle Frank approached me with a new job site requiring overnight shifts, I didn't complain. The schedule change would let me work, while still being able to watch over my brother during the day. On the night I started this new assignment, I packed my dinner, put on my gear, and got into the company car. It was an hour-long drive through the darkness to reach the new location. As I approached from the main road, I saw the silhouettes of two identical buildings. I'd later learned that these buildings housed various office businesses that rented space during normal business hours. The buildings were nicknamed the Twin Towers since they were completely identical from the outside, with matching interior layouts, connected only by a single open courtyard between them. My job was simple: secure both buildings at night by locking all doors and setting the alarms. Then I could just sit in my car to stay warm. I met Uncle Frank outside the East Tower, where he was smoking a cigarette next to his car. "Good to see you found the place, nephew," he said as I got out. "I'll show you around. I already did a walkthrough with the property manager this morning." I nodded and told him it was good to see him too. Most of my jobs didn't require much explanation, just knowing where the alarms were located and which doors needed to be secured. I followed Uncle Frank into the East Tower. He unlocked the front doors with a large key ring, then led me to an alarm panel mounted in the wall near the entrance. He showed me how the system worked and texted me the codes for arming and disarming it. I'd need to arm it at the start of my shift and disarm it before employees arrived for work in the morning. Standard procedure. Then we took the elevator up. On our way up, I couldn't help feeling nauseous from the smell of tobacco that still clung to him. Both Dad and Uncle Frank had been smokers, but I wasn't one to judge other people's choices. "All you need to do inside," he said, "is make sure no one's left in the building before locking up. We don't want to trap janitors or maintenance workers inside all night or trigger false alarms." I nodded, trying to fight down the queasy feeling. The elevator doors opened into a lobby area. "By the time you start your shift," he explained, "this should be the last floor with anyone still working. Make sure you note in your report that you checked all rooms and that cleaning was completed properly. Management is very particular about keeping their offices spotless, We walked down the hallway, looking through glass walls that made up most of the office spaces. Eventually, we reached an open area filled with cubicles and desks. We didn't spend long there, just a quick scan to ensure no one was still inside and nothing had been left behind. He also mentioned, "I've been told some employees like to leave personal items behind, but they have a tendency to disappear. So if you see anything that looks important, make sure to bring it down to the lobby desk for lost and found. I don't want our company taking blame if important documents or electronics go missing." I agreed I'd do exactly that when something colorful caught my eye on one of the desks. I pointed it out to him, and we both took a closer look. Sitting on the corner of someone's workspace was an unopened bag of chips, some kind of cheese-flavored snacks that weren't my preference. Uncle Frank just shrugged. "Probably someone's afternoon snack. Not important, just leave it there." I didn't want to upset anyone in case it was their favorite treat. So we left the chips alone and headed back to the elevator. We went up several more floors, basically repeating the same process and finding nothing particularly interesting, until we reached a floor that housed several conference rooms. I imagine the company executives used these rooms most often. They were set up with the most expensive rolling chairs money could buy and touchscreen projectors in each room. This floor was easy to check since it also had glass walls and doors throughout. If anyone was up there, we'd spot them immediately. After Uncle Frank finished showing me around, we headed back downstairs. He watched me enter the code from my phone notes, and the alarm began giving slow warning beeps to indicate it was armed. We had about 20 seconds to exit before the system would activate completely. We locked the doors after stepping outside and repeated the exact same process in the West Tower. When I was told the buildings were practically identical, it wasn't an exaggeration. I was starting to think this job site would be my most boring assignment yet. We did everything the same way and armed the West Tower system too. After Uncle Frank finished his third cigarette of the evening, he said he'd leave everything in my hands from here on out. There was a lot of trust between us, so he knew I wouldn't cause any problems watching two empty buildings by myself all night without needing supervision. He asked if I needed anything, and I said I was all set. He nodded and got in his car, tossing his cigarette butt into the parking lot. Not long after that, I was completely alone. The hardest part of the job would be staying awake. Fortunately, I had several podcasts I enjoyed that I could listen to while working. When those ended, I could watch videos or movies on my phone. Like I said, it was straightforward work. Occasionally, I felt like walking around the grounds, sometimes on foot, sometimes driving around in my car. There was only one road leading to the Twin Towers, so trespassers didn't seem to be an issue. I wondered why they even needed an on-site guard. My first few hours passed without incident. I'd opened an energy drink and eaten all the snacks I'd brought so I wouldn't get jittery toward the end of my shift. But that might have been a mistake. As I mentioned, trying not to fall asleep was the most challenging part. The caffeine was wearing off, and I could feel boredom starting to turn into drowsiness. That's when I looked up at the West Tower and saw a light moving past one of the windows. I paused the video I was watching and tried to get a better view. It couldn't have been light from any passing cars. The chances of any traffic at this hour were pretty slim anyway. To me, it looked more like a flashlight beam moving from room to room. I watched the light travel slowly across the 8th floor, then back again, and I was certain it wasn't any trick of lighting or reflection. I quickly turned off my car and got out to approach the building. I was surprised that no alarm was sounding, which suggested it couldn't have been a break-in, and I didn't see anyone near the building exterior. I unlocked the doors, and the security system began its warning beeps. This gave me several seconds to disable the alarm before it would actually trigger, so I did exactly that. I remembered which floor I'd seen the lights on, so I took the elevator straight up to the 8th floor. As the elevator doors opened, I was met with complete darkness. I shined my flashlight across the hallway, illuminating the cubicle area, then called out, "Security." No response. All the doors to individual offices between the elevator and cubicles were closed. These led to rooms without glass walls, which meant I'd have to check each one individually. One by one, I opened each door and scanned inside with my flashlight. I didn't see any evidence that anyone had been in them. Then I went and checked each cubicle in case someone might be hiding. Still nothing. I was starting to think I was imagining things when I looked across the courtyard toward the East Tower. My stomach dropped when I saw a similar light floating past a window in the other building. I thought for a moment it might be a reflection of my own light, but when I turned mine off, my fears were confirmed. It wasn't mine. I cursed under my breath, thinking it might be a light that had been left on or something we'd missed during our initial walkthrough. Maybe it was just playing tricks on my tired eyes. I hurried back to the elevator to check the other building. That's when it happened. As I was walking toward the elevator, focused on pressing the call button, slam. One of the doors I just passed suddenly opened and shut with such force that it made me jump completely out of my skin. I'd never had such an intense fight or flight response in my life. The only thing my brain could manage was to leap away from the noise and press my back against the wall. My head whipped back and forth as I checked all around me for threats. No one was there in the hallway. My nerves were still on fire, but I eventually worked up the courage to peel myself off the wall. I narrowed down which door had made the slamming noise, one that I'd just walked past. I knew it had been closed when I approached it initially. I had closed it myself during my check. But if someone was hiding in there, I nervously placed my hand on the cold doorknob, then quickly opened the door while shining my light inside. No one was in there. I checked all the corners, but there simply wasn't anyone hiding in that room. What the hell? I muttered. I had to be losing my mind. I couldn't have heard that door slam by itself. It couldn't have been the wind or building settling. Slowly and carefully, I shut the door again. This time I kept my eyes on it while I backed toward the elevator and hit the call button. The elevator seemed to take forever to arrive, which I thought was strange since it should have been waiting on this floor. As I stepped inside and pressed the button to go down, the doors closed and I was hit with that same queasy feeling I'd had earlier. Then the smell of tobacco was overwhelming, as if Uncle Frank was still in the elevator with me. But I hadn't smelled it on the way up. I held my nose the entire ride down, fighting my stomach until the doors finally opened and I rushed out. I didn't forget to set the alarm before locking the doors. As I came out of the building, I looked up at the East Tower. I could no longer see the light I'd spotted before, but it was still my responsibility to investigate. The fresh air helped calm my nerves, but that gut feeling was still churning inside me. I unlocked the doors and disabled the alarm, then took the elevator up. This time I started from the 8th floor and worked my way down to the 1st, being thorough. I didn't find anything. When I checked the final floor, however, I was searching carefully through all the cubicles, almost hoping to find a real person, a living, breathing human being, just to make sense of what I'd experienced. That's when I came to the desk that had the bag of chips on it earlier. I approached it and found the bag had been opened. Not just opened, it looked like someone had slammed their fist down on it, bursting it apart and spraying chips and crumbs all over the desk and surrounding floor. It was a complete mess. I sighed, thinking I'd surely get blamed for it, when it occurred to me that this was evidence someone had been in the building. I quickly looked around again, but found no one. No other evidence that anyone was there. Nothing else disturbed, nothing stolen. I was standing there in the middle of the dark cubicle area when I heard and felt warm breath on my ear. I spun around in shock, whipping my flashlight toward whoever was near me. But again, no one. I had never felt more terrified in my life. My eyes were wide, and all my senses were screaming that I was in danger. I still can't explain it. I just wanted to get out, to leave. I didn't bother setting the alarm again. I headed straight out of the building, quickly locking the door behind me. But as I was walking toward my car, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was someone sitting in my car. Someone without features, more like a shadow in the shape of a person. I wasn't actually sure what I was looking at. It couldn't be a real person because my car had been locked. The beam of my flashlight didn't reach that far across the parking lot, and I didn't dare get any closer yet. All I could do was stand there frozen, staring at the dark shape in my car until the sun started to rise. I might have actually frozen to death if I didn't have the warm jacket Dad had bought me with his own money. I'm not sure exactly how long I stood there outside the East Tower. I eventually closed my eyes and think I dozed off standing up when I heard the sound of a car engine. It wasn't my car, but another vehicle arriving for the morning shift. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw that the shadowy figure was no longer in my car. I waved to the approaching vehicle as a middle-aged Hispanic woman got out. She must have been part of the cleaning crew. I unlocked the doors for her, not bothering to go back inside myself, and walked across the courtyard to open the West Tower. That was the building she needed to access first. As I was disabling the alarm, she came in with me. I felt better not having to be in the building alone, and I think she felt the same way. In broken English, she asked me to come with her to the 8th floor. I swallowed hard but agreed to do it. So I accompanied her back up that elevator. This time there was no tobacco smell, so my nausea didn't return. However, when we reached the 8th floor, there was quite a sight waiting for us. Every office chair had been overturned, and nearly every trash can had been thrown from its cubicle. I was struck by the devastation. It looked like a tornado had blown through there overnight. The cleaning woman simply sighed and began picking everything up, like she'd seen this before. As we walked past one of the conference rooms, I saw that all the expensive rolling chairs had also been picked up, flipped over, and stacked on top of the meeting tables. She gave me a suspicious look, like she thought I was the one responsible, or maybe that I'd failed to catch whoever had done this. After she cleaned up the area with my help, she thanked me and said she could handle the rest by herself until her daughter arrived to help. I nodded and headed back downstairs. It wasn't long before I got back to my car and found 2 missed texts and several voicemails from Uncle Frank, wondering if I was okay and why I hadn't clocked out yet. I took a deep breath and texted him back. "I don't think I can work here anymore after tonight." He was confused, but didn't argue or ask for details. I never really enjoyed security work anyway. I only did it to help out the family, maybe make Dad proud. But after that night, I don't think I have the nerves for security work ever again. Back in 2018, I was living the college dropout life, spending my days on the couch eating junk food and watching comedians make fun of mall cops and security guards for being wannabe police officers. It's pretty ironic that I ended up becoming a security guard myself that same year, and would have one of the creepiest encounters of my life not long after starting. There I was, 24 years old, working security at Pinewood Mall in a mid-sized town in Alabama. Not exactly where I thought my life would end up. Really, I was just a guy trying to pay rent and figure out what I wanted to do with my future. The thing about working mall security in a place like ours is that nothing exciting really happens. Maybe we'd catch someone shoplifting once every couple of weeks, break up a fight between teenagers every few months. Most of the time, it was just walking around, checking that doors were locked at the right times, making sure the heating and air conditioning were working properly, basically boring maintenance stuff. This particular morning was right after Thanksgiving, so we were heading into the Christmas shopping season. I remember because all the stores were starting to put up their holiday decorations, and mall management had us working extra shifts to handle the increased crowds that would be coming through. It was still dark outside when I arrived around 6:30 in the morning, an hour and a half before we'd open the doors to shoppers. There were 3 of us on the morning crew, me, Derek, and Jason. Derek was an older guy, maybe in his 50s, who had been doing security work for about 15 years. Jason was even newer than me, early 20s like myself, but still lived with his parents. Good guys, really, both of them. Got into a routine where we'd meet up at the main entrance, unlock everything, turn off the overnight alarm systems, then do a complete walkthrough while store employees started arriving. The mall itself wasn't huge, but it wasn't tiny either. Typical layout with anchor stores on both ends, smaller shops in between, and a food court in the center. The building was about 20 years old. The roof had an unusual design where it was flat in the center section, but sloped down at the edges. So if you were in one of the outer stores, the roof was much lower above you than it was over the main walkways. We'd been there maybe an hour that morning, getting everything ready for opening, when my radio crackled to life. An employee from the vintage clothing store on the north end had called in. She was a woman in her 60s who had been running that particular store for about 10 years. A real no-nonsense type, not the kind of person to call security unless something was actually wrong. She said she needed someone to check something out, so I headed over since I was closest to her location. She was standing behind her counter, looking up at the ceiling with this worried expression. Her store was right on the outer edge of the mall, so she had the lower sloped roof section above her space. I asked what was going on. She said there was someone walking around up there and pointed at the ceiling. She could hear footsteps going back and forth, and they'd been going on for about 10 minutes. I listened carefully, and sure enough, I heard it too. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the roof above us. Step, step, step in one direction, a pause, then step, step, step back the other way. I asked if she was sure it wasn't just maintenance, though I was pretty confident I knew the answer. She said that's what she thought initially, but but she'd called the management office to check the work schedule. There was nothing on the books about roof-related work today. Nothing scheduled up there at all. So yeah, she was right. It wasn't maintenance. The footsteps kept going back and forth, back and forth. It was strange because they sounded so regular and methodical. Not like someone working or trying to fix something, or even someone trying to sneak around. Just steady, normal walking. I told her I'd go investigate, and in my head, I figured it was probably some homeless guy who'd found a way up there. Maybe he thought it would be a safe place to sleep or something. I radioed Derek to let him know what was happening, then headed for the maintenance access that led to the roof. The mall had a service ladder that went up to the flat center section of the roof. From there, you could walk to the edge and look down at the sloped sections, but you couldn't actually walk on those sloped parts. Too steep and too dangerous. If maintenance ever had to go out there, they would use safety equipment and a proper ladder. It took me about 5 minutes to get up there. It was pretty cold outside, and the sun was just starting to come up. I walked across the flat section toward the north side, where the vintage clothing store was located. When I got to the edge and looked over at the sloped part, I saw him. There was a man walking back and forth on that sloped roof, exactly like the store owner had described. He was maybe 30 feet away from me, walking parallel to the edge of the building. The slope wasn't extremely steep, maybe 15 or 20 degrees, so it was walkable if you were careful. But it still seemed incredibly dangerous. The guy looked rough, like really rough. His clothes were torn and filthy, like he'd been living on the streets for months. His hair was long and tangled, and he was thin in that unhealthy way that comes from not getting regular meals. But what really got to me were his eyes, completely bloodshot, not just a little red like someone who hadn't slept. I'm talking about eyes that were more red than white, like every blood vessel had burst. "Hey," I called out to him. "Sir, you can't be up here." He stopped walking and turned to look at me real slow. He stared at me with those horrifying bloodshot eyes. To be honest, it sent a chill down my spine. Something was seriously wrong with this guy. "You all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. "This roof is private property. I need you to come down from there." For several seconds, he just continued staring at me. But then his mouth opened wide, and he let out the loudest, most terrifying scream I've ever heard in my life. It was so loud and sudden that I instinctively took a step back from the edge. The scream went on for several seconds, echoing off the buildings around the mall. I had to look down to watch my footing since the roof edge wasn't protected by any kind of safety barrier, and I didn't want to fall. I reached for my radio to call for backup, and when I looked up again, maybe 2 seconds later, the man was completely gone. Just vanished. But here's the part that still gives me chills when I think about it. I could still hear his scream for another few seconds after I couldn't see him anymore. That horrible, bone-chilling scream was still coming from the exact same spot where he'd been standing. I looked around frantically. There was nowhere for him to go. The sloped section of the roof ended at the edge of the building, which was a straight drop of about 25 feet to the parking lot below. There was no ladder, no fire escape, no way for him to climb down safely. The slope was too steep and too far from the flat section for him to have climbed up to where I was standing. The only way down was to jump or fall, and that would have seriously injured anyone. Broken legs at minimum, probably much worse. I ran back across the flat roof to the ladder and climbed down as fast as I could. Then I sprinted outside to the north parking lot, to the spot where he would have landed if he'd jumped. Nothing. No blood, no body, no sign that anyone had fallen or landed hard. I spent about 10 minutes walking around that entire area, checking behind dumpsters and cars, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. But there was absolutely nothing. When I went back inside, the vintage store owner was waiting for me, asking if everything was okay up there. I told her. Yeah, everything's fine. False alarm. Probably just some debris blowing around in the wind. I didn't want to tell her what I'd actually seen in case it might frighten her. I went back to the security office where Derek and Jason were going through the morning reports. Derek immediately wanted to know what that was all about. I told them everything. I expected them to think I was crazy or making it up, but Derek believed me right away. He said that strange things do sometimes happen in security work, that even he'd seen things that just don't make logical sense. Jason looked skeptical but didn't say anything. The rest of the morning went normally. We opened the mall to shoppers, did our regular patrols, handled a couple of minor issues. Then around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my radio crackled again. It was the owner of the electronics store. His shop was on the south side of the mall, also on the outer edge with the lower roof section. I asked what was up. I hate to bother you guys, but I think there's someone walking around on the roof. I can hear footsteps up there. My stomach dropped. I asked if he was sure. He said he was certain. Said they were walking back and forth like someone pacing. I looked at Derek and Jason. Derek raised an eyebrow, but Jason stood up and said he'd go check it out. I asked if he was sure that I could handle it if he wanted, but he insisted. But then I had an idea. I told him to go ahead, but to do me a favor. Go straight up to the roof, walk to the south edge, and look down at the sloped section. Don't call out to anyone if you see someone. Don't even try to talk to them. Just look first, then radio me immediately and tell me what you see. Jason looked confused, but nodded and agreed. After he left, Derek looked at me and asked if I thought it was the same guy. I told him I wasn't sure, but I had a strong suspicion. We waited about 5 minutes when Jason's voice came over the radio. He said there was indeed a guy up there, a homeless-looking man walking back and forth on the sloped section. He described how the guy's eyes looked completely messed up. My stomach turned, but I also felt oddly vindicated. This is what I said to him. Okay, Jason, listen carefully. Turn your radio volume all the way up and keep the channel open. Then tell the guy you're going to get a ladder so you can help him down safely. Don't try to engage with him beyond that. Jason just said, okay. I started listening as he keyed his radio and kept the channel open. A second or two later, I heard his voice telling the man he was going to get a ladder to help him down, asking him to please stay right there. A moment later, it came. That horrible scream, loud enough that it came through Jason's radio, clearly even though he was probably 30 feet away from the guy. Even Derek jumped in his chair and asked what in God's name that was. I was practically yelling into the radio, half laughing while I did it, telling Jason to run and get out of there immediately. I could hear his footsteps pounding across the roof through the radio, then the sound of him climbing down the ladder quickly. A few minutes later, he burst through the security office door, completely out of breath and wide-eyed. He was asking me what the hell that was, but I wanted to know where the guy went. Unfortunately, Jason didn't see. As soon as he heard that scream, he ran out of there as fast as he could. Said it was the creepiest thing he'd ever heard. Then I just started laughing. I couldn't help it. Here I'd been thinking I was losing my mind all day, and Jason had just confirmed that I'd seen exactly what I thought I saw. That's the same guy I saw this morning, I told him. Same bloodshot eyes, same terrifying scream. I bet if you go check the parking lot behind the electronics store right now, there won't be any sign of him anywhere. Still chuckling, even though the whole thing creeped me out, I said, I think we've got ourselves a ghost. Jason went out to check the south parking lot. When he came back, he still looked shaken up. He said there was no one there, no trace of anyone, no way for someone to climb up there and climb back down without getting seriously hurt. We spent the rest of our shift talking about it. The strangest part about all of this is that it never happened again. I worked at that mall for several more months before finding a better job, and we never had a single new report of someone on the roof, and I couldn't have been more grateful for that. About 6 months ago, I encountered something at my job that still gives me nightmares. I work overnight security for Steelworks Industrial Complex on the outskirts of town. There's a particular part of my job that's a real pain in the neck. About 2 miles from the main complex, there's this access road that leads into a section of dense forest where the company has some equipment storage and a small maintenance building. The whole area is fenced off with high chain link topped with barbed wire. They have this massive, old heavy metal gate at the entrance that I have to open manually every night to do my security rounds. This gate is seriously ancient, and I mean heavy. No automatic opener, no remote control. I have to get out of my patrol car, grab this thing with both hands, and drag it all the way across the road. Opening it takes real effort because the damn thing weighs probably 400 pounds, and the wheels are rusted beyond belief. Then, after I check the storage area and maintenance building, I have to drag it back and close it. Every single night. I'd been doing this job for so long that I was basically on autopilot. Almost every night, this was my routine. Drive out to the gate, get out, open it, drive through, do my security checks, drive back, close the gate, and head back to the main complex. Same thing every night, around 2:30 in the morning. I was exhausted that particular night, and just wanted to get through my rounds so maybe I could catch a few minutes of rest before my shift ended at 6. I pulled up to the gate like always, put the car in park, and got out. I walked over to the gate and grabbed the handle. The road is pretty narrow there, with forest on both sides coming right up to the fence line. There's a single street light about 50 feet back, but it doesn't throw much illumination where the gate is located, so it's always very dark there. I started pulling the gate open. It always made this horrible scraping sound against the asphalt metal grinding on stone. I was focused on getting it open, putting my back into it, because the thing fights you every inch of the way. But I stopped when I heard a rustling sound coming from my left, at the forest edge, right next to the gate. It sounded like something moving quickly through the underbrush. I looked over, just a quick reflexive glance to see what the noise was. What I saw scared the living hell out of me. There was a face looking at me from between the trees, only about 10 feet away from where I was standing. But this wasn't any normal face. It was completely emaciated and sickly looking. The skin was pulled tight against the skull, and the head was completely bald. Its eyes were missing. Like no eyeballs at all, just dark, empty sockets. But it was facing me directly. That's why I describe it as looking at me. Keep in mind, this whole thing lasted maybe 3 seconds, because as soon as I saw it, the face was already starting to pull back into the darkness between the trees. Not like it was walking backwards either, but more like it was drifting back, fading away into the shadows. I screamed, couldn't even control it, I was so freaked out. Probably scared every animal within a quarter mile. I ran back to my car, leaving the gate exactly where it was. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get back in the vehicle. I threw it in reverse and got the hell out of there, leaving the gate wide open behind me. I drove back to the main complex and just sat in the parking lot for about 20 minutes, trying to catch my breath and slow my heart rate. I was completely alone out there. No backup, no one to call. Company policy states we're supposed to complete all our security rounds, but there was no way I was going back to that gate in the dark. I spent the rest of my shift doing paperwork and checking the main buildings. But every time I looked out a window toward the forest, I got goosebumps, thinking I was about to see that face out there again. Just before the next shift arrived, but right after the sun started coming up, I drove back out there to close the gate. I hoped whatever it was wouldn't come back out in daylight. I got out, looked around nervously, then ran as fast as I could to shut the gate even faster than that, then jumped back in my car. This didn't scare me away from my job, but it did make doing the gate part of my rounds pretty nerve-wracking for several weeks. But it helps that I've never encountered anything that creepy again. I mean, so far. I have no idea what it was, and I sincerely hope it was something to do with exhaustion or maybe a strange case of pareidolia. That thing where you see faces in random patterns. I pray I never have to see something like that again. But here's what really bothers me about the whole experience. I've heard from 2 different people in my family that they've seen disembodied faces or heads just out of the corners of their eyes, vivid enough to make them jump and look, only to see nothing there. Now, what's that about? I used to work night shift at an Amazon fulfillment center as a security guard. The security checkpoint was positioned right at the main employee entrance to monitor everyone coming and going from the massive warehouse facility. The job wasn't particularly difficult. I was mostly checking employee badges for the incoming night shift workers and conducting random bag searches when people left their shifts. All warehouse associates had to walk through a metal detector and scan their ID badges to enter the building. Their badge would trigger a green light when they scanned in successfully, and we'd wave them through. If they didn't have their badge that day, they had to wait with me and my partner, while one of us contacted a supervisor or HR to verify their identity and get them temporary access. One night, my partner Richard and I had just finished processing the shift change, watching dozens of day shift workers file out while the night crew came streaming in. I was about to start our hourly perimeter walk when I noticed someone approaching the checkpoint from the employee parking lot. I called out running a bit late tonight, and he responded, "Yeah, traffic was brutal," and then walked toward our station. I don't know why I followed him back inside. Richard could easily handle checking in one straggler by himself, but maybe because I'd made conversation with the guy, I felt obligated to see it through. When the late arrival walked into our checkpoint, I noticed I'd never seen him before, but new people get hired constantly, so it wasn't particularly unusual. As he scanned his badge at the reader, I noticed for the first time in my 6 months working there that the green light appeared, but was immediately followed by a loud, harsh buzzing sound. I was shocked because I'd never seen an employee badge get rejected like that. Then, as he passed through the metal detector, it went off near his waist area. He pointed to his belt buckle and said, "Must be this thing." Standard protocol when the metal detector activates is for the person to remove whatever's setting it off and try walking through again. If it's just a belt buckle, they also need to empty all their pockets for inspection. Against protocol, Richard told him he could just remove his front pockets and try again. But since his badge had failed authentication anyway, we couldn't let him into the facility regardless. So Richard had him sit down in our security office while I called a supervisor. None of the shift supervisors were answering their phones, probably because they were busy getting the night crew organized and dealing with the usual start of shift chaos. After several unsuccessful calls, the late guy said, "Hey, I'm really going to be in trouble if I'm much later. Can I just head in?" I explained that I couldn't allow that because it would cost me my job. He said nobody's going to know. But I pointed up to one of the security cameras mounted in the corner of our office, watching everything we did. His face almost snapped up to look at that camera when I mentioned it, which struck me as odd. I told him I'd try calling HR instead. The night shift HR representative was a pretty laid-back guy named Patricia Gomes, who would often chat with us during our breaks. The overnight HR role was basically just handling employee complaints and resolving minor disputes that couldn't wait until morning. When she answered her phone, I asked if she could come down and verify this employee's identity so we could get him checked in. She said she was in the middle of handling a disciplinary meeting and asked if I could just give her his name and badge number from his ID card. I read her the name and number from the guy's badge, and Patricia told me she'd look into it and call me back. While we waited, the late arrival asked us if we'd ever encountered anything crazy while working security. I told him not really, and Richard shared a story about finding someone trying to break into cars in the employee parking lot a few months back. I got a call back from Patricia, and when I heard what she had to say, my blood practically turned to ice. Patricia informed me that the guy sitting in our office was actually a former employee. He'd been terminated 3 weeks ago because he'd been involved in a serious altercation with his supervisor. Apparently, he'd threatened physical violence when confronted about his poor performance and excessive absences. Patricia instructed me to ask him to leave the premises immediately and to call the police if he refused to go. I didn't know what to say, so I improvised and told him that only a day shift supervisor was available to verify employment, and nobody from day shift was working tonight. He then said, "Well, let me go find some of my coworkers. They know me and can vouch that I work here." I pointed to the camera again and explained that if it wasn't an official supervisor verification, I could get in serious trouble. He then asked, "Well, how am I supposed to get paid for tonight?" At this point, I knew for certain that he no longer worked there, so I told him I would make sure to inform management that he'd shown up for his shift, and they would pay him for a full night without him having to actually work. Clearly frustrated and running out of excuses, he stood up and left our security checkpoint. As he walked away, I noticed something bulky in his back pocket, something that definitely looked like it could be a small weapon or tool. It wasn't shaped like a phone or wallet, that was for sure. The rest of the night passed without incident. The next day when I came in for my shift, my supervisor was waiting to greet Richard and me. He shook both our hands and said, "Outstanding job last night, both of you." He then informed us that the guy from the previous night had returned early that morning and crashed his pickup truck straight through the main security gate. Apparently he'd been under the influence of methamphetamines, so when he crashed, he lost consciousness for a while until the police arrived on scene. When they searched his vehicle, officers found zip ties, duct tape, a crowbar, and what appeared to be a detailed floor plan of our facility that he'd somehow obtained. Basically everything you'd need for a kidnapping or worse. He was arrested on multiple charges and I never heard anything more about the case after that. I ended up quitting just a few weeks later. The whole experience really shook me up. I still can't believe Richard, and I sat in that small office with a potential kidnapper for over 20 minutes. And I wonder what might have happened if I just let Richard handle checking the guy in by himself that night. Worked security for most of my adult life, and a good chunk of that has been overnight shifts. Sometimes people ask me about the wildest place I've ever worked, or the easiest gig I've had, or what my most terrifying moment on the job was. Strangely enough, the answer to the last two questions is the same place, and folks are always surprised when I tell them. Because honestly, I think the best security job I ever had was working the night shift at the Riverside Museum of Ancient History. Some people think I'm nuts for saying that all alone in the middle of the night, with nothing but dusty old artifacts and ancient mummies for company. But as long as you don't believe in curses or any of that supernatural nonsense, the job is absolutely perfect. Nobody in their right mind wants to break into a museum in the dead of night. Sure, they had some pretty valuable pieces on display. Some of those Egyptian sarcophagi were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the medieval armor collection wasn't exactly cheap either. But again, only the most desperate of thieves would try to steal a 7-foot-tall marble statue, and they'd need a whole crew and a truck to pull it off. Since I certainly didn't have to worry about anyone breaking out of their display cases, I basically had nothing to do. I guess the museum board just considered me an insurance requirement, something to make the donors feel better about their precious donations being properly protected overnight. I'm serious, though. Aside from my hourly rounds through the galleries, all I did was study for my online degree and work out in the old staff break room. But ironically enough, it was at this cushy security job that I had the most unsettling encounter of my entire career. I was about 8 months into the position, and aside from the whole graveyard shift thing, I was absolutely loving every minute of it. I've been taking night classes in criminal justice, trying to work my way up to detective work, so I spent most evenings walking around with my headphones on, listening to recorded lectures while I made my rounds. So there I was one night, sitting in the main security office where all the monitor feeds came together, casually glancing over to check the exterior cameras. Now keep in mind, in all the months I'd been watching those screens, the most exciting thing I'd ever seen was maybe a stray cat wandering through the parking lot. The rest of the time, they showed absolutely nothing but empty walkways and parked cars. Only this particular night, as I'm trying to understand some complex legal terminology, I see someone standing completely motionless in the museum's front courtyard. The sight immediately gets this what the hell reaction out of me, not because I was seeing a person for the first time, but because they were just standing there, perfectly still, staring directly at the main entrance. The figure was so motionless for so long that if it wasn't for the time stamp counting away in the corner of the screen, you'd think the camera had frozen. But then he shifted slightly, and I realized he was actually just standing there like some kind of living statue, eyes locked on the museum building. It was a cold October night, so I grabbed my jacket and flashlight, preparing to go outside and ask the person to move along. But just before I left the office, I checked the screen one more time. Nothing. There was no longer anyone standing in the courtyard. Best case scenario, it was just some homeless guy who'd wandered off. Worst case scenario, it called for a complete sweep of the entire museum grounds. I walked out into the courtyard, but I didn't see anyone. Just because I couldn't spot him didn't mean he wasn't still around though. So I started checking around the building perimeter to make sure Statue Man wasn't planning any trouble. I'm walking around with my flashlight, seeing nothing unusual, when I check the rear loading dock area and hear some shuffling sounds followed by quick footsteps. This guy must have seen my flashlight beam before I turned the corner and just took off running before I could catch him. Because when I rounded the corner, all I saw was some hooded figure sprinting away about 50 yards from me. Remember what I said about only the most desperate thieves trying to rob a museum? Well, that's exactly what I figured this was. And since I don't mess around with potentially dangerous criminals, I went right back inside, made sure all the doors were secure, and called the police to file a report. I didn't need them to send a unit over or anything. I just wanted them to have something on file for the next time I called, because I had this sinking feeling that I'd be calling them about this guy again very soon. And I was absolutely right. The second time I caught the guy lurking around, he was much bolder about it. I'd stopped listening to my lectures during work, and for good reason, because the next time he showed up, I heard him before I saw him. The first time, I heard faint sounds of him testing the front entrance doors, trying to see if they'd open. Since the security office had a direct view of the main lobby, I could see the door handles moving slightly. The second time I knew something was definitely wrong was when the guy violently tried to force the doors open, because I heard this tremendous bang echo through the marble hallway. Now the museum had these massive glass and bronze double doors, meaning you could see right through from both directions. I didn't get a good look at the guy's face, but he definitely got a clear view of mine. And just like the first encounter, he immediately ran off into the darkness. The same pattern kept repeating for weeks on end. At first, maybe once a week, then sometimes twice a week. Then by the end of it all, I was having to chase this guy away 3 times a week. I called the police every single time, giving them the best description I could manage. But they never got back to me saying they'd picked anyone up or spotted anything suspicious during their patrols. I wasn't sure what exactly he was looking for, or if he was staying off the main roads to avoid detection. But it was what it was, I guess. I was there to do my job and protect the museum's collection. It didn't really scare me or anything. It was just incredibly frustrating, to be honest. I had this perfect, easy job, and this weird guy kept showing up and forcing me to actually work for my paycheck. I know that hardly sounds like a tragedy, but just wait. I haven't even gotten to the truly disturbing part yet, which happened at the very end of this whole midnight visitor saga. So the last time the guy appeared, I expected it to play out just like all the previous encounters. I spotted him on the camera, standing completely still in the courtyard, exactly like the first time I'd seen him. He did that frequently, by the way, especially after he figured out that he simply couldn't break into the building. But every time I walked outside to tell him to leave, he'd always run away before I could say a word to him. Only this time, the final time as I walk out of the security office, and he spots me through the glass doors, he doesn't run. He doesn't move at all. He just stares me down as I walk out into the dark courtyard. Don't get me wrong, the sudden change in behavior definitely made me nervous, and I started wondering if he might have some kind of weapon on him. But the chance of finally being able to ask this guy what his deal was, after weeks and weeks of curious frustration, I just couldn't bring myself to pass that opportunity up. I didn't approach him directly or anything. I just stepped outside the main entrance and into the courtyard, watching as he stared back at me from under his hood. That's when I first realized how young the guy actually was. I mean, he looked like a teenager, but from his build and the sparse facial hair, you could tell he was probably late teens or maybe early 20s. He also wasn't glaring at me aggressively like I thought he would be. He looked kind of sad and exhausted. As I stared back at him, a few seconds passed before I finally asked him why he kept coming here night after night. He didn't say anything in response, and I know this sounds strange, it was like he was trying to speak, but just couldn't get the words out. I figured he might have some kind of developmental disability or something. He definitely didn't look like your typical drug addict. When it became clear that I was going to be doing all the talking, I went ahead and laid out my whole speech. I told him he needed to stay away from the museum, that I was running out of patience with these visits, and that if he showed up again, I was going to have him arrested and banned from the property permanently. I wasn't too harsh about it. It came across more like a firm warning than a threat. But still, the guy didn't respond, and he just kept looking at me with that same sad expression. I decided to try one more time to get him to talk, and if he didn't want to communicate, I'd just go back inside and call the police like usual. I honestly didn't expect him to say anything at that point either, so I asked the most basic question on my mind. Why? Why keep showing up week after week, trying to get into a museum at night? But again, nothing. At least until I turned to walk back into the building. Because that's when the guy finally found his voice and told me what he wanted. And I'll remember exactly what he said for the rest of my life. He started, then paused. As you can imagine, I immediately spun around to hear him out. Then, after a few more seconds, all he says is, "I just want to touch one." I knew what he was talking about right away. I just didn't want to believe that's what he meant. So I asked him directly, "Touch one of what?" I knew what he was referring to, and he knew that I knew what he was talking about. But he just didn't want to say it out loud. And as much as I tried to get him to be specific, he knew better than to actually tell me what, or more accurately, who he wanted to touch. When I realized he wasn't going to elaborate, I told him to get professional help, and that I was going inside to report this conversation to the police, including the obvious implication. I also made it clear that if I ever saw him hanging around the museum or any other cultural institution, I was going to make sure he got arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The guy looked like he was trying to say something else, and I gave him about a minute to get it out, but he couldn't manage it. So I went back inside to call the police. The guy never showed up again, and that really was the final time I saw him. I'd like to think it was my stern warning that scared him off for good, but I have this terrible feeling that he just moved on to target some other museum, some other place with ancient remains, until he finally gets what he's looking for. Before I finally retired for good, I worked a security job at a complex of storage units just outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. I just finished a 35-year career as a state trooper, so I walked into this position thinking it would be an easy way to supplement my retirement income until I was too old to work anymore. Turns out it was far more eventful than I'd anticipated. I didn't mind working nights much. That's part of the reason the owner hired me in the first place. I didn't have any particular reason to be awake during the day anyway, not since my wife had passed and my daughter moved her family out to Oregon. I hate to bring the mood down like that, but the truth is what it is. Plus, it made sense to have someone with experience and instincts guarding the units overnight when they were most vulnerable to break-ins. So that's how I started working nights, 4 days on, 4 days off, on what turned out to be some of the most boring shifts I'd ever worked in my life. For months, The most exciting thing that happened was encountering a pack of coyotes near the back fence. We just stared at each other for a few minutes until they decided to wander off. Moments like that made the solitude bearable, those quiet desert nights, after so many years of high-stress law enforcement. But then there was one particular night when my peaceful routine got disrupted by exactly the kind of evil that had prompted my retirement from the force in the first place. I thought I'd left behind the terrible things that human beings are capable of doing to each other. But instead, it followed me to my quiet little security job. It was around 2:30 in the morning when a group of men came walking past the facility's small office. The office was positioned right next to the main entrance, so you could see everyone coming and going through a large window by the door. As the group passed by the window, one of the men looked inside and made direct eye contact with me. The next thing I knew, he was knocking on the office door and letting himself in. He was impeccably dressed, probably in his early 30s, spoke with a slight accent, but his English was perfect. And I was immediately struck by how genuinely friendly he seemed. He greeted me warmly, asked if I was the facility's security guard, and when I confirmed that I was, he acted like it was some kind of prestigious position. I would have thought he was being sarcastic if it wasn't for the fact that he came across as completely sincere. He introduced himself as Roberto and explained that he and his associates would be conducting some late-night business in one of the storage units. I joked that I hoped it wasn't anything illegal, which prompted genuine laughter from Roberto before he assured me that everything was completely legitimate. He told me that he and his partners rented Unit 42 and that they were in the import business, specializing in authentic Mexican folk art and colonial-era furniture. Now I've always been a history buff, and I happen to know quite a bit about Spanish colonial artifacts and Mexican craftsmanship. I ended up asking Roberto about some of the pieces he kept in storage, and he seemed remarkably knowledgeable about the business. He also appeared to share my passion for regional history, and when he demonstrated familiarity with obscure historical figures like Hernan Cortez's lesser-known expeditions, I was genuinely impressed. The office had a small seating area with a coffee maker and water cooler for customers, and a few minutes into our conversation, Roberto offered to make me a cup of coffee. He said he sympathized with me having to stay awake all night and went on about how exhausting it must be. I told him it really wasn't too bad and thanked him for the thoughtful gesture. Then we continued discussing history and antiques. We talked for maybe 30 or 40 minutes, and I gathered that Roberto was an extremely intelligent and apparently very wealthy individual. He didn't explicitly discuss his finances, but I started noticing his expensive-looking watch and jewelry, and the dollar amounts he mentioned when talking about certain rare pieces were in the 5- and 6-figure range. Anyway, as I was saying, we had this engaging conversation when suddenly Roberto's associates appeared and knocked on the office door. He excused himself, saying he had to get back to work, but shook my hand very warmly while thanking me for such an interesting discussion. I walked him to the door, wished him a good night, then turned around to head back inside when my old cop instincts suddenly kicked in. Police work, especially detective work, is all about paying attention to details. You learn to notice discrepancies, whether they're in numbers, behaviors, or patterns. It's something the department drills into you, and it never really goes away once it's ingrained. When Roberto's group had first arrived at the facility, I'd counted 5 men total walking past the office window. But when they were leaving, I only saw 4 men getting into a black Chevy Suburban, definitely 4 total. And I was 99% certain that 5 had originally entered the property. I stood there wondering if my detective instincts were finally starting to deteriorate with age. Maybe I'd miscounted. Maybe there had only been 4 of them from the beginning. But if I was right, where was the 5th man? I decided to take a walk around Unit 42, the storage space that Roberto and his associates claimed to be renting. After all, it couldn't hurt to just take a look around, right? I finished the coffee that the suspiciously charming man had made for me, then walked over to Unit 42. As soon as I was standing outside of it, I knew something was terribly wrong. I imagine there aren't many people reading this who have been present at a murder scene before, and that can only be a good thing. If you have been, there are certain sensory details that stay with you forever. For me, it was always the smell of fresh blood. Hot blood has this metallic, coppery scent that I've always described as rusty, though that probably sounds strange, because it's not a comparison that makes sense until you've actually smelled large quantities of it straight from the source. But when you do encounter that smell, rusty is really the only word that captures it. It's not a putrid odor, it doesn't make you nauseous or anything. But my God, once you smell it, you never forget it. And that hot, metallic scent of fresh blood was exactly what I detected outside Unit 42 that night. It was the smell of significant blood loss, still warm in the humid desert air, and I was willing to bet my pension that it was coming from inside that storage unit. I immediately called 911, got connected with a police dispatcher, and explained exactly why I had reasonable suspicion. I told them who I was, mentioned my decades of law enforcement experience, and said I needed uniformed officers on scene as soon as possible. We kept bolt cutters on the property for emergencies, so I could remove the padlock, but I needed official law enforcement present to witness whatever was inside. 2 officers arrived within 45 minutes. I walked them over to the unit and explained the situation. It didn't require much explanation. One of the officers put his nose right up to the gap at the bottom of the storage unit door, took one breath, and told me to cut that lock off immediately. When I did, that metallic, coppery smell of fresh blood hit us like a physical wave. The entire interior of the storage unit was lined with heavy plastic sheeting, which was completely soaked in blood. There were just 2 pieces of equipment inside. One was a long metal table covered with various bloody tools and instruments, and the other was what looked like a modified dental chair with a broken, mutilated body strapped into it. For several minutes, the 3 of us just stood there, hypnotized by the sheer horror of this makeshift torture chamber. In all my years in law enforcement, I'd never encountered anything quite this methodical and brutal. Whoever had assembled this setup had even bothered to partially soundproof the interior walls, probably for added security. Though I suspect it was the gag on the victim that really prevented any screams from being heard. I won't go into detail about the specific mutilations that had been performed on the victim, but I will tell you one thing for certain. Whoever wanted this person dead had wanted them to suffer extensively and slowly. They'd made sure that death would seem like a mercy when it finally arrived. Within a few hours, there were dozens of officers swarming the facility, with all kinds of forensic vehicles parked outside. They kept coming and going for almost a week afterward. The story made it into the local media, and a news crew even showed up on one of my days off to film the forensics team still processing the scene. But after the initial coverage, the media went quiet on details, and it stayed that way for quite a while. A few months later, I found myself still thinking about the murder, so I contacted one of my former colleagues who was still with the state police. He told me it was cartel-related, which I'd suspected from the beginning. But as the investigators pieced together the who and why of it, a deeply disturbing picture emerged. My old partner informed me that the friendly man who'd bought me coffee that night wasn't actually named Roberto. He was more likely Carlos Mendoza, one of the Juarez cartel's top enforcers operating north of the border. Carlos had sat there discussing Mexican history and sipping coffee with me like a perfect gentleman, while his men tortured his own cousin to death in storage unit 42. Word had come down from the DEA that they'd lost a confidential informant in the Juarez cartel's Las Vegas operation, and the timing coincided almost exactly with when we discovered the body. So the department put two and two together and concluded it was cartel business. And there was little point in pursuing it further, since the killers were probably already back in Mexico. It's a tale as old as time in my part of the country. You'd think that after nearly 4 decades in law enforcement, I'd be more accustomed to the evil that people can inflict on one another. But the way that cartel lieutenant could just sit there making casual conversation about history, while knowing his own flesh and blood was being systematically tortured and killed just yards away. It takes an incredibly cold heart to do something like that. It's almost inhuman. I don't know if these people are genuinely psychotic or if the money and power make them capable of such things. But I suspect that feelings of betrayal really motivated that young man's murder. They say blood is thicker than water, but I can tell you for certain, they made that boy bleed very slowly. After I got out of the military, a fellow veteran helped me get a job as a security guard working for a regional contractor. They paid for me to get my security license, which is the certification you need if you want to work private security in England. And after working with them for a while, I moved from company to company trying to work my way up the ladder. I eventually ended up working for a major grocery chain, which I was dreading at first, but I took to it more than I expected. It's a social job, which suits me, considerably less dangerous than the military, but not exactly boring either, which was one of my main concerns. I thought I'd be sitting around all day chasing teenagers away from shoplifting candy bars or whatever. But it turns out there were several quite intense moments as well. Nothing too serious for the most part, but there was this one incident that was worse than anything I'd experienced during my deployment to Bosnia. This was mid-June of 1998, and I remember that specifically because what I'm about to tell you happened just a few days after England lost to Argentina in the World Cup on penalties. My father-in-law, God rest his soul, was a massive England supporter, and the dejected look he had at Sunday dinner the next week still makes me smile to this day. I was in the security office of this large grocery store, not sure I should say which chain, and I must have been quite absorbed in whatever paperwork I was completing, because when my radio crackled to life, It nearly scared me out of my chair. It had been an unusually quiet Tuesday afternoon, so I wasn't expecting anything major. But when I heard the voice coming through the static, I realized something serious was happening. I was partnered with this big, gentle giant named Colin, a 6'4" teddy bear who wasn't fazed by anything. And Colin sounded genuinely nervous when he called for backup that day. He told me he was in the alcohol section, which was located at the back of the store near the pharmacy. And that meant I had to walk all the way through the shop to reach him. The closer I got, the more I could see some kind of disturbance happening in the wine and spirits aisle. One elderly woman even pushed her shopping cart up to me and started pleading with me to go help my colleague, saying there was a frightening man with no shoes on threatening him with a broken bottle. I immediately broke into a jog, turning into the alcohol aisle to see Big Colin facing down a man in a long overcoat. The woman was correct about him being barefoot, but he also wore what was clearly a hospital gown. And I remember thinking that if it wasn't for the overcoat, I'd probably be able to see a hospital wristband on him. The man was maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, and he kept shouting at Colin to stay away from him. Colin hadn't intended to approach the guy at all. Standard procedure required 2 guards to be present during any attempt to neutralize a threat. But as I arrived, and Colin started moving closer with the intention of subduing him, the man started grabbing bottles of liquor off the shelves and smashing them on the floor in front of us. Since this represented a clear and immediate danger to customers, I told Colin to start evacuating the store and to get the staff to help with that. This obviously left me alone with our subject, but since he was clearly acting defensively, I figured I could keep the situation contained until Colin had helped clear the area. In order to try and distract the man from any further violence or destruction of merchandise, I started asking him what his problem was, in the friendliest way possible, of course. I had no idea what kind of response he was going to give, but I assumed it would be something incoherent. After all, he was wearing a hospital gown and clearly having some kind of mental breakdown. So I didn't expect anything rational from what I assumed was likely a psychiatric patient. But when he actually spoke, what he said sent chills down my spine. They put something inside me. I need to cut it out. I need to get it out. I asked him what he meant by someone putting something inside him, and whether he needed to go back to the hospital. I honestly thought that listening to him and asking questions would calm him down. Turns out my second question triggered a massively angry reaction. He started screaming, "I'm not going back there. You can't make me." And things like that, and he grabbed a bottle of something and hurled it down the aisle at me. It was a wild throw, so it didn't hit me, but it was enough to make me back off several feet, while I assured him that no one was going to force him to go anywhere. It was a lie, of course. Once the police had him, they could do whatever they wanted with him. But for the time being, I had to keep him from hurting anyone while also focusing on preventing further property damage. I concentrated on telling him that he wouldn't have to return to any hospital, and that all I wanted was to make sure he was safe. After enough of that kind of reassurance, he seemed to relax slightly. But then, instead of calming down, the guy seemed to go completely in the opposite direction. To my horror, he started walking toward me through all the broken glass on the floor. I started telling him, "Hey, don't do that, you're going to hurt yourself." But he didn't listen. and the first crunch of glass under his bare foot made my skin crawl. I thought he'd immediately jump back and lose his balance. I mean, the pain must have been unimaginable, with all that broken glass cutting into his feet, and all the alcohol on the ground seeping into his cuts. The strangest thing was that he just didn't seem to feel any pain at all. He just kept walking, and as he did, he started tearing up and said, "I just need to get it out of me," in this shaky voice that made it sound like he was about to cry. Then he just sat down among the spilled alcohol and broken glass, which again made me wince terribly. I kept asking what it was that was inside him and who he thought had put it there. Anything to distract him and make it seem like I genuinely cared. Don't get me wrong, I did care what happened to him. I'm only human, after all, and the guy seemed to be genuinely suffering from something. But he couldn't seem to give me a coherent answer, and I'm not even sure he was listening by that point, because he kept pressing his fingers into his face and neck and arms. It looked like he was searching for something underneath his skin, and I suppose he was looking for whatever they had supposedly put inside him. God knows who they were, and I had no idea what he thought they'd implanted in him, but he seemed absolutely convinced of it, and he proved that beyond all doubt with his next action. When the man first picked up a large shard of broken bottle, I thought he might be planning to attack me with it, so my first instinct was to back away from him even more. I told him to put it down, and that there was no need for anyone to get hurt. But again, he seemed to barely hear me. I watched as he started prodding at one of his eyes. Then he started muttering to himself. And then, before I could get close enough to stop him, he started pushing the piece of broken glass into the skin just below his eyeball. All I could do was react. I nearly slipped and fell as I went through the giant puddle of spilled liquor, but I made it across and grabbed the arm that was holding the glass shard, then wrenched it away from his face. Remember, in his other hand was a larger piece of broken bottle that he was gripping by the neck, and he got several good swipes at my legs before I was able to circle around and drag him away from the broken glass. I remember hearing screams from customers who hadn't been properly evacuated from the area, and realizing there was quite a lot of blood trailing along the floor from where I was dragging the guy. I didn't really know what I was going to do from there. It was all just a short-term solution to stop the man from harming himself, but fortunately, he solved the biggest problem for me. In order to regain his footing, the guy had to let go of the broken bottle to use his free hand for balance. That gave me the perfect opportunity to drag him away from it before wrestling him to the ground again. After pinning his arms down, I was able to basically sit on his chest until Colin returned to help me. I was hoping he might have exhausted himself, but no, the entire time he was bucking and struggling, and I don't know if it was the adrenaline, but he was much stronger than he appeared. Honestly, if Colin hadn't gotten back when he did, I'm not sure I could have held him much longer. He was completely frantic, still ready for a fight despite all his injuries. He kept saying really disturbing things too, claiming I was working with them, whoever they were, and that if I had any children, I should kill them because they would be coming for them next. I told him I had no idea who they were, and I swear to God, he looks at me and says, "But now you know, and that means you're finished." I know the guy was out of his mind, and that I shouldn't have paid attention to anything he was saying. But in the moment, thinking about my daughter, some of that stuff really got under my skin. Eventually, the police did show up, and we helped get the man into restraints and into their van. He was kicking and spitting the whole way, but in the end, the job was done, and we were back in the office cleaning ourselves with antiseptic wipes before filling out incident reports. And that, my friends, was the single most disturbing incident I'd ever dealt with. And I was on duty during the London riots back in 2011. That was just mob mentality, something I could understand given how young and reckless the rioters tended to be. But what happened that day with the man in the hospital gown has stayed with me for decades. We never found out what was wrong with him or whether he ended up getting better. But I suppose that's life, isn't it? It's a series of unanswered questions. But what I've figured out is that there are some questions I'd rather not know the answers to. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.